The morning Renata Cruz made the worst decision of her life, it was raining. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that smells like earth and promise. This was the other kind. Cold. Indifferent. The kind that soaks through secondhand coats and runs down the back of your neck no matter how far you hunch your shoulders. She stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the county housing office with her 7-year-old daughter Maya pressed against her side, both of them staring at a single sheet of paper that the clerk inside had slid across the counter with the flat-eyed patience of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it had stopped feeling like news at all. 30 days. That was what the paper said. 30 days to vacate the unit they had called home for 3 years, the apartment above the laundromat on Claremont Avenue, where the pipes knocked every winter and the heat only worked on alternate weeks, and the smell of other people's detergent lived permanently in the walls. 30 days, because the building had been sold and the new owners had plans, and Renata and Maya did not fit into those plans any more than a weed fits into a garden. Renata folded the paper once, then twice, then tucked it into her coat pocket with the deliberate calm of a woman who had learned long ago that falling apart in public cost you things you couldn't afford to lose. "Are we going home, Mommy?" Maya asked. "Yes, baby," Renata said. "We're going home." She said it the way people say things they need to be true even when they know the word is slipping. Renata Cruz had been sliding toward this moment for longer than 30 days. She had been sliding toward it since the night 2 years ago when the restaurant where she worked as a line cook shuttered without warning, the owners vanishing with 3 weeks of unpaid wages and a hand-lettered sign on the door that said simply, "Thank you for everything." She had been sliding since the morning she realized that the savings account she had spent 4 years carefully filling now held enough to cover exactly 11 weeks of rent, groceries, and the medication Maya needed for her asthma. She had been sliding since she applied for 43 jobs in a single month and heard back from 6 and got offers from none. The world, Renata had come to understand, was not cruel in the theatrical way that movies made it seem. It was cruel in the bureaucratic way, in the form of papers slid across counters, of automated rejection emails, of phone calls that went to voicemail and stayed there. She was 34 years old, sharp-minded and hardworking, with a daughter who was clever and kind and deserved better than every single thing that was currently happening to her. That gap, between what Maya deserved and what Renata could provide, was the wound that would not close. The weeks after the eviction notice passed in a blur of phone calls, waiting rooms, and the particular exhaustion that comes not from working hard, but from working hard at things that go nowhere. She looked at apartments and found that everything within her budget was either a scam or a place she would not take Maya. She called family. Her sister in Phoenix had a new baby and a husband who had made his feelings about house guests clear without ever saying a word. Her mother in Sacramento was renting a room herself, in someone else's house, in someone else's story. Friends offered couches and sympathy with the implicit understanding that both had a time limit attached. It was during this period, in the strange, desperate hours between midnight and dawn when Maya was asleep and the apartment felt both too small and too temporary, that Renata started scrolling. It began as idle searching, the way people do when they cannot sleep and do not want to think, but cannot stop thinking. She looked at properties in places she'd never heard of, not because she expected to buy anything, but because looking felt like a form of action, and action felt like the opposite of drowning. That was how she found Dalton. Or rather, that was how she found a listing for the entirety of Dalton, New Mexico, offered in a county tax auction for a starting bid of $100. She stared at the listing for a long time. The photos were bad, the lighting gray and flat, taken on a phone camera by someone who either didn't care or had given up caring, which she suspected amounted to the same thing. The images showed a main street that was nothing but a wide dirt road flanked by buildings in various stages of decomposition. A gas station with no pumps. A general store with no windows. A church with a steeple that leaned at an angle that suggested either architectural ambition or structural surrender. A water tower listing to one side. Maybe 20 structures in total, spread across what looked like 2 or 3 square blocks of desert scrubland, with the mountains rising behind everything in that impassive way that mountains have, as though the drama of human life was simply too small to concern them. The county description was brief. Ghost town property. Unincorporated. No active utilities. Previously the township of Dalton, established 1887, abandoned 1971. Sold as is for outstanding tax debt. Minimum bid $100. Renata read it 3 times. Then she opened a new tab and searched for Dalton, New Mexico. What came back was almost nothing. A few sentences on a regional history website. A grainy photograph from 1962 showing a main street that had once been, if not exactly prosperous, then at least alive. A brief mention in a book about ghost towns that described Dalton as, quote, a silver mining community that declined rapidly following the closure of the Harrow Creek Mine in 1969, its remaining residents departing within 2 years. And that was essentially all. No news coverage. No development plans. No curious visitors who had taken weekend road trips and posted photos. Dalton, New Mexico had slipped out of the world's awareness so completely that asking about it felt like asking about something that had never quite existed. She went back to the listing. $100. She had $83 in her account and 3 weeks left on the notice. She closed the laptop and went to bed. She lay there listening to Maya breathe in the next room. That small, steady sound that was the most important sound in her world, and she thought about what it meant to have nothing left to lose. She thought about it for a long time. And then she thought about something her grandmother used to say, a woman who had fled one country for another with 2 children and a suitcase and not much else. She used to say that the door you are afraid to open is usually the one you were meant to walk through. Renata got up, opened the laptop again, and spent the next 2 hours researching everything she could find about New Mexico ghost town laws, tax auction procedures, property rights, and what happened to people who bought places that no one wanted. What she discovered was this. The auction was real. The property was real. The county's motivation was simple. They wanted someone, anyone, to take on the tax liability and remove the properties from their ledger. The minimum bid was the minimum bid. Nobody else had placed one in 3 auction cycles. She had $83. She needed $100. She called her friend Deanna the next morning, a woman she had worked alongside in the restaurant kitchen for 2 years, who had lent her $20 before and pretended not to remember it. Deanna listened to the whole story in silence and then said, "You want to buy a ghost town?" And Renata said yes. And Deanna said, "I have $120 I was going to use for a jacket. I do not need the jacket. And also I think you have lost your mind. Here is the money. Please do not die in the desert." Renata placed the bid the following morning, the $100 she had borrowed sitting in a certified form in the county's online system. She expected to be outbid. She expected the whole thing to fall apart in some bureaucratic way she hadn't anticipated. She expected nothing to work because nothing had been working, and she had grown accustomed to the specific weight of disappointment. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the county of Mora, New Mexico, informing Renata Cruz that she was the sole bidder and that the property formerly constituting the township of Dalton was now hers, pending the payment of outstanding tax debt in the amount of $11.40 and the signing of the attached transfer documents. She read the letter in the hallway outside the apartment, still in her coat, because the mail had come late and she had been on her way in from a job interview that had not gone well. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the hallway floor, which was a thing she had not done since she was small, and cried for a few minutes with the relief of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had finally found somewhere to set it down. It was not the answer to her problems. She knew that. A crumbling ghost town in the New Mexico desert was not a home, was not a job, was not stability or safety or the kind of life she wanted Maya to have. It was, at best, a place to be while she figured out what came next. But it was hers. In a season where everything had been taken away or was in the process of being taken, that word, hers, felt like something solid to stand on. Maya took the news with the specific adaptability of children who have already learned that the world shifts and you shift with it. When Renata told her they were moving, that they were going somewhere different, somewhere with a lot of open space and old buildings, Maya had asked 2 questions. The first was whether there would be animals. The second was whether there was a school nearby. Renata answered the first question with probably yes, and the second with we'll figure it out, which was the most honest thing she could say. They packed what they could into Renata's 12-year-old sedan, the same car that had been making a sound in the front left wheel that she chose not to investigate because some knowledge only costs money. They packed clothes and bedding and Maya's books and the cast-iron skillet that had been Renata's grandmother's and was the one possession she would not leave behind under any circumstances. They packed a toolkit. They packed a camp stove and enough canned goods for 2 weeks, because she was practical even in the grip of desperate hope. The drive from Albuquerque, where they had spent the last 3 nights in a motel, was 4 hours southeast through landscape that changed slowly and then all at once. The highway gave way to state roads that gave way to county routes that gave way finally to a track of gravel and packed dirt that the county records described as the Dalton Access Road, and that could more accurately be described as the suggestion of a road that the desert had been gradually reclaiming for 50 years. The mountains in the distance turned from blue to brown to a deep reddish gold as the afternoon light shifted. The scrub brush stretched in every direction, pale and dry and ancient-looking. The sky was enormous out here in the way that only desert sky can be, too big to fully look at, pressing down on everything with a weight that felt like being watched. Maya had her face against the window. "It's like another planet," she said. "It kind of is," Renata agreed. "I like it," Maya said. And Renata glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror, at that small, serious face framed by the impossible landscape, and felt something loosen in her chest. The particular tightness that had been there for months, the constant bracing for the next piece of bad news, released just slightly, like a fist opening one finger at a time. The first sight of Dalton came around a curve in the road where a dry creek bed cut through the terrain, and the town appeared on the other side of it in the late afternoon light, like something a child might draw from memory. Main Street, if you could call it that, was exactly as the photos had shown, a wide dirt road flanked by structures in varying states of dissolution. But the photographs had not conveyed the scale, which was somehow both smaller and larger than she had imagined. Smaller because the whole of it could be walked end to end in 5 minutes. Larger because even in ruin, the buildings had a presence, a weight, that photographs didn't capture. These were not flimsy things. They had been built by people who intended them to last, and even in their degradation, they had not entirely surrendered that intention. The general store was the largest building, its facade still carrying the ghostly shadow of lettering that had once announced its name. The church stood at the far end of the street, its steeple asserting itself at an angle that was less alarming in person than in photos, more of a considered lean than an imminent collapse. The gas station had been stripped clean of anything useful. Several of the smaller structures, houses she assumed, were little more than walls now, the roofs having given up and come down. But a handful, 4 or 5, appeared to have retained some structural integrity, their walls upright, their roofs in questionable but present condition. Renata parked the car in the middle of the road because there was no reason not to. The silence when she turned off the engine was absolute in the way that silence can only be absolute in places where there is nothing alive to break it. No traffic, no machinery, no voices. Just wind moving through the gaps in boards and the distant sound of something. Maybe a bird. Maybe just the desert settling into evening. Maya climbed out of the car and stood in the middle of the street and turned in a slow circle with her arms slightly out, as though measuring the space with her body. "Mommy," she said. "Yes." Maya turned to face her, and her expression was something Renata had not seen on her daughter's face in months. Pure, uncomplicated wonder. "Someone was living here," Maya said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered with the certainty of a child who reads the world directly, without filters. "A lot of people," Renata said. "A long time ago." Maya looked at the buildings again. "Not just a long time ago," she said. And then she turned and walked toward the general store as though she had been there before and remembered the way. Renata watched her go and felt the hair on the back of her neck rise, just slightly, just for a moment, the way it does when something ordinary briefly opens into something else. She followed her daughter into the silence of a town that had been waiting, though for what, she could not yet say. The inside of the general store smelled like time. There was no other way to describe it. Not rot, not dust exactly, though both were present. Something older than that, the accumulated stillness of a place that had held its breath for 50 years. The shelves along the walls were empty and warped. The floor was wide pine board, gray with age, and in places bowed upward where the boards had swelled and dried through decades of desert summers. Light came through the front windows in thin orange bars, the evening sun cutting through grime in a way that made the whole interior look like the interior of something ancient, a ship or a church or a cave. Maya walked through it with her arms at her sides, not touching anything, just moving through the space with that same quality of deliberate attention that Renata had sometimes noticed in her daughter and couldn't entirely explain. She stopped near the back of the store, at a wooden counter that ran the full width of the room, behind which the original owner would have stood, and she put her hand flat on the surface. "Someone was here today," she said. Renata stopped walking. "What do you mean?" Maya looked up at her. "I don't know. It just feels that way." Renata scanned the room. No footprints in the dust that weren't her own or Maya's. No sign of disturbed surfaces. Nothing but the settling stillness of the abandoned. "The building is making sounds," she said. "Old wood does that, especially in the evening when it cools down." Maya nodded as though that explained it, and also as though she didn't quite believe it. They made camp in the general store that first night because its roof was the most intact of any structure she'd checked, and because Maya had decided, with the quiet authority she sometimes deployed, that this was where they would be. Renata set up the camp stove on the old counter and heated soup from a can, and they sat together on their bedrolls in the fading light and ate with the sound of the desert settling around them. "Tell me about this place," Maya said. "Silver mining town," Renata said. "People came here in the 1880s because there was silver in the mountains. They built all this, lived here for almost 100 years. And then the silver ran out and they left. All of them. That's what it seems like. Over a few years. One by one, until there was nobody left." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Did they take everything with them?" "The things they could carry," Renata said. "The rest they left." Maya looked around the dark interior of the store. "What did they leave?" Renata thought about that. "We'll find out," she said. They fell asleep to the sound of nothing, which is its own kind of sound, and Renata lay in the dark for a long time after Maya's breathing slowed and steadied, staring at the ceiling of a building she now owned in a town that was entirely her responsibility. The weight of that was enormous. She lay under it and breathed deliberately and allowed herself, just for these few hours, to not know what she was doing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In the morning, she got a better look at everything. She had known it would be bad. She had prepared herself for bad. But there is knowing and there is seeing, and what she saw in the gray early light of the first full morning was a kind of badness that had its own interior logic, its own almost dignity. These buildings had not given up. They had been given up on. There was a difference. She walked every structure methodically, notebook in hand, the way she had organized her job search, room by room, problem by problem, priority by priority. She was not someone who approached difficulty from the outside and retreated. She was someone who walked into the middle of it and started cataloging. The church, structurally concerning but not lost. The steeple's lean was the result of a failed support on the north side, reparable with the right materials. The walls were solid sandstone, 2 feet thick in places, the kind of construction that laughed at time. The windows had been boarded at some point, the boards now gray and loose, but still serving their purpose. 3 of the houses along the main street were shells, roofless, the walls standing but open to the sky. 2 others had partial roofs and appeared to have been more recently inhabited, maybe by the occasional squatter or explorer, because the interiors showed signs of human presence that were newer than 50 years ago. A fire ring of stones in the corner of one. A piece of plastic tarp, crumbling now, nailed over a window in another. The gas station was a frame. Nothing more. She walked through it and out the other side, and it was just wind and concrete slab. The water tower, she discovered upon close inspection, was not in as bad shape as she had feared. The tower itself was structurally sound, the legs intact, the tank apparently sealed. Whether there was water in it, she could not immediately tell. The town had presumably had a well at some point, and probably still had access to the aquifer, which was the one deeply encouraging thought she'd had since arriving. And then there was the building at the end of the street, south of the church, set back slightly from the line of the others. She had noticed it the evening before, a larger structure than the houses, smaller than the general store, built of the same pale sandstone, but with a quality of construction that was subtly different, more deliberate. The walls were not just thick but precise, the stones cut and fitted with care rather than simply stacked. The windows on the front face had been not merely boarded but sealed. The boards fitted into the frames with iron brackets that had been bolted through rather than nailed. The door was iron-banded hardwood, heavy, and though the wood had dried and cracked over the decades, the bands themselves were as solid as the day they were made. There was no sign above the door. Whatever it had been called or used for, the town had not announced it. She tried the door and found it locked with a mechanism she could not immediately identify. Not a standard padlock, not a deadbolt, but something built into the door itself, an iron plate with a keyhole that looked old enough to have been cast by hand. She tried the windows and found the iron brackets immovable without tools she didn't have with her. She noted it in the notebook and moved on. She would come back. The days that followed had the quality of very hard, very purposeful work, which is one of the few conditions that makes time feel both fast and full. Renata had no illusions about what she was doing or how much there was to do. She was one woman with a toolkit, limited supplies, and a 7-year-old who had appointed herself chief assistant and took the role with the seriousness it deserved. What she was attempting to do in this ghost town was not restore it, not flip it, not develop it. She was simply trying to make one building safe enough to live in while she figured out the rest. The general store became their home base. She repaired the most dangerous sections of the floor, replacing 3 boards that had given way entirely, using wood scavenged from the shell houses where the timber was still sound. She cleared the windows of their grime and found that the glass, though old and wavy, was intact, which was more than she'd hoped. She patched the roof where the afternoon light showed through in thin lines, using a combination of salvaged wood and the rolls of heavy-duty plastic sheeting she brought from Albuquerque. It was not beautiful work, but it was functional, which was the only criterion that mattered right now. Maya moved through all of this with a self-possession that still occasionally stopped Renata in the middle of whatever she was doing. She helped when she could and stayed out of the way when she couldn't and spent the hours in between exploring. She had designated herself the official historian of Dalton and began keeping her own notebook, in which she recorded everything she found. A tin button behind the baseboards of the church. 3 glass bottles with the embossed mark of a bottling company that no longer existed. An iron hook on the wall of one of the houses at the precise height of a child's coat, which she found personally significant. A newspaper, so degraded it was mostly dust, but with a fragment of a date still legible. 1968, 3 years before the town was abandoned. On the 4th evening, as the light turned the color of an old coin and the desert cooled into its strange velvet softness, Maya came to find Renata at the back of the general store, where she was examining the wall for moisture damage, and said the thing she had been building toward for 4 days without knowing she was building toward anything. "Mommy, I want to show you something in the locked building." Renata straightened. "I told you to stay away from that one. The door is locked." "Not the door," Maya said. "Come and see." She followed her daughter down the main street in the early evening quiet, the dirt soft under their boots, the mountains behind the town turning their evening colors. Maya led her around the side of the locked building to the south face, the one that did not look onto the street. The wall here was the same pale sandstone as the front, but at its base, half concealed by 50 years of wind-blown debris and the encroachment of desert scrub, there was a window. Small, barely 2 feet wide, set low in the wall. And unlike the windows on the front, this one had not been sealed with iron brackets. It had simply been buried. They cleared the debris together, Maya on her knees pulling dry brush and dirt away while Renata worked the larger stones back from the base of the wall. It took 20 minutes. At the end of it, the window was clear, and the boarding over it was a single plank that, when Renata worked at it with her pry bar, came away in her hands, rotted through at its fastening points. The glass behind it was dark with interior grime, but intact. Renata pressed her face to it and cupped her hands around her eyes against the remaining evening light. At first she saw nothing, just darkness and the suggestions of shapes. Tables maybe, shelving, the geometry of an interior. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she saw the floor. Or rather she saw what the floor was made of. Not the wide pine board of the general store, not beaten earth. The floor of this room was set with stone tiles, and even through 50 years of accumulated grime, even in near darkness, she could see that they had a quality that the rest of Dalton entirely lacked. They were cut, precisely, beautifully, in a pattern. She pulled back from the window and stood upright. Her hands were not quite steady. What is it? Maya asked. I don't know yet, Renata said. But it's interesting. Maya looked at the window, and then at her mother, and then back at the window. Someone worked very hard to keep people out, she said, and it was not a childish observation. It was the observation of a small person who had been paying very close attention. Renata looked at the iron-banded door at the front of the building, the bracket sealed with a precision that spoke of intention, the lock built into the door rather than added to it, the care that had been taken by whoever sealed this building to ensure that whatever was inside stayed inside. And her mind went back to the county records she had read before the auction, the history website's brief mention of Dalton, the reference to the Harrow Creek Mine. The mine had closed in 1969. The town had been abandoned by 1971. But someone had sealed this building, had sealed it with care, with permanence, with iron and stone. Not the casual boarding up of a building being left behind. The thorough, deliberate sealing of a building whose contents someone intended to protect. She put her hand flat against the wall the way Maya had put her hand on the counter of the general store, as though the stone could tell her something if she was willing to listen. We'll need tools, she said. Better tools than I have. How long? Maya asked. Renata looked at the building, at the door, at the iron brackets, at the deep, careful precision of its construction. I'll go into Las Vegas tomorrow, she said, meaning the small New Mexico City 50 miles north, not the Nevada one, the town that was her closest access to anything resembling a hardware store. I'll get what I need. Maya nodded. She was still looking at the building. It's been waiting, she said, in that matter-of-fact way she had. The tone she used when she was stating something so obvious she hadn't thought it needed emphasis. Renata looked at her daughter. What do you mean? Maya thought about it. Like when something waits because it knows the right person is coming. This building waited because it knew someone would come who actually wanted to know what was inside. Not take it or sell it. Actually, no. Renata stood in the gathering dark of the desert evening and looked at the building that had sealed itself against 50 years of abandonment and weather and whoever might have come to Dalton in those decades, of whom there had apparently been no one, or no one who had looked closely enough, or no one who had a small girl who noticed what other people did not. You think that's us? Renata asked. Maya turned to face her. Even in the fading light, her expression was utterly serious. Don't you? She said. That night, lying in her sleeping bag in the general store with the desert silence pressing gently against the patched walls, Renata did something she had not done in a very long time. She allowed herself to imagine. Not to plan, not to calculate, not to problem solve. Just to imagine. What if there was something in that building? What if the people who had left Dalton in those last years, 1969, 1970, 1971, had left something behind not out of carelessness, but out of necessity? What if the sealing of that building was not the act of abandonment, but the act of preservation? What if they had hidden something there with the intention of coming back for it, and had not come back, and whatever they had hidden had waited all these years in the dark under those carefully cut stone tiles? She knew these were the thoughts of a desperate person. She knew the track record of desperate people imagining their way out of impossible situations. She had been that person for long enough to know how it usually ended. But she also knew what she had seen through that window. The quality of those stone tiles, even through 50 years of grime. The precision of their cutting, the care of their laying, the careful sealing of a building in a dying town, performed by someone who knew what they were doing and had good reasons for doing it. She fell asleep to the sound of nothing and dreamed about doors. She drove to Las Vegas, New Mexico the next morning alone, Maya in the care of a local woman named Iris Begay, who ran the only open business within 20 miles of Dalton, a feed and supply store in the small community of Mora, who had introduced herself the week before with the specific warmth of people in remote places who understand that neighbors are not optional. Iris had taken one look at Renata and Maya and said that if they needed anything to come find her, and Renata, who had learned to accept help when she needed it even when it cost her something in the way of pride, had said she would. In Las Vegas, she bought a lockpicking set and watched 2 hours of tutorials on her phone in the hardware store parking lot. She bought a better pry bar, a diamond blade cutting disc for her drill, a powerful work lamp, and a set of chisels. She bought a new phone charger because hers was dying, and a box of granola bars because they were running low on easy food, and she stood in the checkout line at the hardware store doing mental calculations about how much of her remaining cash she had just spent, which was almost all of it, and what she was doing, which could fairly be described as spending the last of her money on tools to open a building that might contain nothing but 50 years of dust. She drove back through the mountains in the afternoon light with the tools on the back seat and the window cracked, and the specific feeling that she was moving towards something, not away from it. She could not have explained why she believed this. She had very little basis for believing it. But the belief was there, solid and persistent, in the same place that things sit when they are not hopes but certainties. When she returned to Dalton, Maya was waiting on the steps of the general store with Iris beside her, both of them eating from a tin of biscuits Iris had brought. And Maya's expression when she saw the tools was exactly the expression of someone who has been waiting for something to begin. Tomorrow, Renata told her. Tonight? Maya asked. Renata looked at the locked building, at its sealed face in the late afternoon gold. Tonight, she said. I'm going to at least get the lock. The lock took 2 hours. It was a piece of 19th century iron engineering, a lever lock of a type that Renata had to look up twice on her phone before she understood its mechanism, and which resisted her with the stolid patience of something that had been successfully keeping people out for over a century and saw no reason to change its policy now. She worked at it in the fading light and then in the beam of her work lamp as dark came on, Maya beside her most of the time, sometimes asking questions, sometimes just watching, occasionally handing her a tool with the quiet competence of a good assistant. The mechanism gave at 11 minutes past 9 in the evening, with a sound that was less like a lock opening and more like something releasing, a deep and considered exhale of iron that Renata felt in the bones of her hands. The door did not open immediately. The wood had swelled and contracted through 50 cycles of desert summer and winter and had fitted itself so firmly in its frame that she had to work the pry bar into the seal at the top and walk it down the edge before the whole thing sighed free with a low, deep sound that she felt in her sternum. The air that came out was cold, not the ambient cool of the desert night, but something colder, stiller, older. Air that had not moved in half a century, with a mineral edge to it, dry and precise. The smell was not unpleasant. It was more like the smell of a sealed jar, something preserved rather than something decayed. Renata switched on the work lamp and pointed it inside. The room was larger than it had appeared from outside. The ceiling was low and vaulted, the same sandstone as the walls, and it ran back farther than the external dimensions had suggested, which meant, as she would understand later, that the building extended into the hillside behind it. Toward that rear wall, the floor descended in 3 broad steps, so that the back portion of the room sat lower than the front, like an amphitheater in miniature. The stone tiles on the floor were as extraordinary as she had glimpsed through the window. They covered the entire surface, even the 3 steps, cut from a pale gray-green stone she could not immediately identify and laid in a pattern of interlocking geometric shapes, perfectly fitted, without mortar in the way old stone works sometimes, is when the quality of the cutting is sufficient. Not a tile out of place in 50 years. Not a crack in the surface. Whatever that stone was, and whoever had laid it, they had done it with a precision that spoke of knowledge and intention that far exceeded anything else in Dalton. Against the left wall ran a series of built-in shelving units, the same sandstone, fitted to the wall rather than freestanding. The shelves held objects, things that resolved out of the shadows as Renata moved the lamp, ceramic vessels sealed with wax, wooden cases bound with leather straps, a row of glass-stoppered bottles. Whatever those shelves held, they had been placed with care. Against the right wall was a workbench, solid oak, heavy, on which sat 2 objects under canvas covers. The canvas had dried and stiffened to the surface of the objects beneath, but had not deteriorated. And at the far end of the room, at the bottom of those 3 steps, behind a second door that Renata had not been able to see from the window, there was something she had not expected. A handle. A heavy iron handle set into the stone floor itself. A trapdoor. Renata stood at the threshold of the room and did not go in. Not yet. She stood with the cold air moving past her and the work lamp illuminating that extraordinary interior, and she breathed very carefully and deliberately. The way she had breathed on the sidewalk outside the housing office. The way she breathed when she needed the world to stay steady while she thought. Behind her, Maya appeared at her side. Had been there long enough that Renata had not heard her come. She looked up at her mother. "I told you," she said. Renata did not answer. She stood in the doorway of a sealed room in a ghost town that she had bought for $100, looking at a trapdoor in the floor of a building that someone had sealed with iron and intention at the end of a century and a half of Dalton's brief, incomplete life, and she understood that she was standing at the edge of something. Whatever lay behind that trapdoor, whatever was preserved in those ceramic vessels and wooden cases, whatever the Harrow Creek Mine had left behind when it closed, and the people had gone and the desert had come back to reclaim everything it was willing to settle for, was about to be hers to know. Her daughter was pressed against her side, small and warm and absolutely certain. The desert night was enormous and still around them. Renata Cruz, who had been sliding toward nothing for longer than she could bear, took one step forward into the light. She did not open the trapdoor that night. Not because she was afraid, though fear was present, sitting quietly in her chest like a stone she was carrying. Not because she lacked the tools or the will, but because something in the quality of the moment told her that what lay beneath that iron handle deserved more than the end of an exhausting day, more than the flickering beam of a work lamp and two people running on granola bars and adrenaline. She stood at the bottom of those 3 stone steps and looked at the handle for a long time, and then she turned around and took Maya by the hand and walked them both back out into the desert night, and she pulled the iron-banded door as close to closed as its swollen wood would allow. "Tomorrow," she told Maya. Maya looked back at the door. "Okay," she said. And then, after a pause, "It's not going anywhere." Renata looked at her daughter. "No," she agreed. "It's not." They slept better that night than they had since arriving. Renata could not explain it. The ground was the same. The sleeping bags were the same. The silence was the same absolute silence of a place that had opted out of the world. But something had shifted in the quality of the air, as though the releasing of that door had released something else alongside it, some pressure that had been building without her noticing. She woke once in the dark hours, around 3 in the morning by her phone, and lay listening to Maya breathe and to the desert doing its nighttime work, and she felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She turned the feeling over carefully, afraid to press on it too hard in case it was fragile. She had learned, in the past 2 years, not to trust moments of stillness. They had a way of being the pause before the next impact rather than actual peace. But this felt different. This felt like the stillness after something rather than the stillness before it. Like the end of a held breath rather than the beginning of one. She slept until dawn and woke with her mind already moving. The morning was cold and clear in the specific way of high desert mornings, the air with a crystalline edge that softened as the sun climbed. Renata made coffee on the camp stove and oatmeal for Maya, and they sat on the front step of the general store and ate in comfortable silence with the main street of Dalton stretching before them in the early light, the buildings casting long shadows that made the whole place look, for a few minutes, like it was still occupied. Like if you looked quickly and didn't think too hard, you might almost see people moving behind the windows. "Tell me what you think is down there," Maya said. Renata wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I genuinely don't know." "Yes, you do," Maya said. "You just don't want to say it in case it's wrong." Renata looked at her daughter. 7 years old. Sometimes she felt like 7 was a number Maya had been assigned arbitrarily and bore no relationship to the actual age of whatever was looking at her out of those eyes. "The building was sealed very carefully," Renata said slowly, "by someone who knew what they were doing. And that care, that deliberateness, suggests that whatever is inside was put there intentionally. Not left behind. Hidden. Protected." "And the mine," Maya said. She had been listening, Renata realized. All of it. Every word of the history Renata had murmured half to herself while reading her phone in the evenings. "The Harrow Creek Mine closed in 1969, Renata said. The town was abandoned by 1971. Somebody sealed that building in that window of time. Maybe during the closing. Maybe the last people to leave." She paused. Mining operations from that era sometimes involved things that needed to be stored safely. Valuable things. Equipment or samples, assay records, things that were hard to transport quickly. Things you'd come back for. "But nobody came back," Maya said. "Nobody came back," Renata agreed. Maya considered this. "So it's been waiting since 1971. Roughly. That's before you were born." "That's before I was born." Maya set down her bowl and stood up. "Okay," she said. "Let's go." They went. The building in the morning light had a different quality than it had the night before. The cold air of the sealed interior had mixed somewhat with the desert morning, and the smell that met them at the door was still mineral and still old, but less sealed, more open, as though the building was adjusting to being breathed again. Renata set up the work lamp at full power and positioned it to throw light into the rear portion of the room, where the trapdoor sat in the floor below those 3 broad steps. She went through the room methodically before she touched anything, the way she had gone through every structure in Dalton on her first morning, notebook in hand. What she found, examined in full morning light, was different from what she had half seen in exhausted lamplight the night before. The shelving on the left wall held 14 ceramic vessels, sealed at their tops with a dark wax that had dried hard over the decades. Each vessel was approximately the size of a large jar, roughly cylindrical, with a flat base and a narrow neck. They were not identical. 3 were a darker clay, fired harder, with a different texture. The others were lighter, more consistent. All were sealed. All appeared intact. The wooden cases on the workbench were 3 in total. She had counted 2 the night before, but a third sat behind the first and was smaller. Each was locked with a simple iron clasp, not a full lock, just a clasp. She lifted the clasp on the first, and the case opened without resistance. Inside, packed in what had once been sawdust, but was now desiccated to a fine dry powder, lay a row of glass vials, sealed with wax like the ceramic vessels, but smaller, each perhaps 4 inches long. The glass was thick, the old kind, with slight irregularities from hand-blowing. Inside each vial was a substance, heavy and settled to the bottom of the glass. The color was not immediately visible in the dry sawdust, but when she lifted the first vial to the light from the work lamp, she saw it clearly. Dark red, almost black, with a metallic heaviness that made the glass rock in her hand when she tilted it. She put it down very carefully. She opened the second case. This one held documents, rolled and tied with leather cord, so dried it crumbled when she touched it. She did not unroll the documents. She looked at the edge of the nearest roll and could see ink, still dark, on paper that had been protected from moisture and light and had come through 50 years better than she had any right to expect. She closed the case. The third, smaller case held something she did not immediately recognize. A collection of small, flat stones, each perhaps the size of a large coin, each with a number scratched into its surface. They were not random numbers. They were sequential, beginning at 1 and running to 47, with a gap between 31 and 33 where 2 stones were missing. She stared at them for a long time and could not read what they meant. She closed the case and turned to the trapdoor. The iron handle was set flush into the stone tile, a large ring that lay flat against a circular iron plate from which it was hinged. The tile around it was different from the others, a single large piece rather than the fitted geometric pattern, as though it had been placed last, set deliberately over what lay beneath. Renata gripped the ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavy, heavier than she expected. She braced her feet and pulled again with both hands and felt it give, a slight loosening at its edges, then a resistance as though the weight of 50 years pressed down upon it. She pulled a third time, harder, and it rose. Slowly, with a low grinding sound of stone against stone, and then a deep exhale of air from below that was colder than anything she had felt since arriving, colder than the desert night, cold in a way that spoke of depth and stillness, and the perfect preservation that comes from sealing something in darkness and leaving it completely alone. She held the trapdoor up and looked down. Steps, cut stone, descending into darkness that her work lamp reached only partially. The walls of the shaft below were the same pale sandstone as the building, and they continued down farther than the lamp showed clearly. The air coming up was cold and dry and smelled of iron and of something else, something she associated distantly with old coins, with metal held in a closed hand. She looked at Maya. "Stay here," she said. "I mean it. On the top step. Don't come down until I say." Maya nodded with the expression of someone who was absolutely going to comply and was also absolutely going to watch every single thing that happened. Renata took the work lamp and descended. The steps numbered 11. She counted them as she went, partly from habit and partly because counting was something to do with her mind while the rest of her was occupied with the growing reality of what she was walking into. The shaft was narrow, perhaps 4 feet wide, and the walls were close enough that she could have touched both sides simultaneously. The ceiling dropped as the steps descended, and by the bottom she was in a crouch, her lamp held out before her. Then the shaft opened. Not by a lot. Not into some cathedral of underground space. But enough. She straightened slowly, her hand with the lamp rising, and the beam swept the interior of the room below. It was rectangular, perhaps 20 feet by 30. The ceiling was low, perhaps 7 feet, reinforced with heavy timber beams that had survived the decades in the same state of solid endurance that characterized everything in this building, as though whoever had constructed it had built not for the present, but for the very long future. The walls were stone, like everything else, and along 3 of those walls ran a construction she had not expected. Shelving. Not wooden shelving like the room above. Stone shelving, built into the wall itself. 3 tiers running the full length of each wall, and on those shelves, in the beam of her work lamp, sat objects. She moved the light slowly, deliberately, the way you move through something you are afraid of disturbing, not because you fear what it will do, but because you fear what it means. The first shelf held ingots. She knew what they were immediately because she had seen photographs, and because the color was unmistakable even under 50 years of tarnish, that deep reddish gray that silver takes on when it oxidizes. They were stacked in rows, each perhaps 10 inches long and 2 inches square, and they went from one end of the shelf to the other without a gap. She counted along the first row. 40. She looked at the shelf above. 40 more. She looked at the shelf above that. 40 more. She turned to the left wall. The same. 3 tiers. Full. She turned to the right wall, and her lamp trembled in her hand because the shelves there held something different. Not ingots. Smaller objects. She moved closer and leaned in and saw that they were not uniformly sized. They were sealed in the same glass vials she had found upstairs, dozens of them, in rows, and between the vials were objects wrapped in cloth that had desiccated but held. She reached for one with shaking hands and unwrapped it carefully. Inside the cloth was a stone, but not the kind of stone you pick up in a field. It was dark, nearly black, irregular in shape, and when the lamplight hit it at the angle she was holding it, it threw backlight in a way that made her breath go out of her body. She knew enough. She had done enough reading in those desperate midnight hours to know what she was looking at even without being certain. She had read about uncut gemstones, about the way rough stones look nothing like the faceted jewels in photographs, about the specific way that certain minerals catch light. She wrapped it back in its cloth. Her hands were not steady. She looked at the rear wall, the one she had not yet examined, and what she saw there nearly put her on the floor. Not shelves. A door, set into the stone wall of the underground room. Iron-banded like the door above, but smaller, and unlike the door above, it had no lock. It was held shut by 2 iron bars that slid horizontally through brackets, the simplest and most absolute of mechanisms. She crossed the room, stepping carefully, and slid the first bar free. Then the second, and she pulled the door open. Behind it was a space the size of a large closet, and inside that space, stacked floor to ceiling, were wooden crates. She counted them before she opened one. 18 crates, each approximately the size of a moving box, each constructed of the same hardwood as the cases upstairs, each banded with iron straps. She chose the nearest one and worked the clasp free. The wood resisted slightly, but came up. She lifted the lid. Inside, in rows of sawdust packing, lay coins. Hundreds of them. She picked one up. It was heavy, heavier than she expected, the heft of something with genuine metallic density. The face was worn but legible. Old mint marks. Dates. She had to bring the lamp close to read. She sat down on the stone floor of the underground room of a sealed building in a ghost town she had bought for $100, with a coin minted in 1889 in her hand, and she tried very carefully and deliberately not to make a sound. Not because she was trying to control herself, though she was, but because the silence of this place felt sacred in some way she could not articulate, the silence of something that had been kept for a very long time and deserved to be met with equal gravity. She sat there for perhaps 3 minutes, which was all she had before she heard Maya's voice from the top of the shaft. "Mommy, are you okay?" She tilted her head back. "Yes," she called up, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Come down." She heard small feet on stone steps. Heard Maya crouch at the bottom where the ceiling was low. Heard the intake of breath as her daughter straightened and the lamp's beam caught the shelves. Maya did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "Oh, just that. Oh," with the weight of a word that has had to do the work of 100 words because no single word is equal to the moment. "Yes," Renata said. "Oh." Maya came to stand beside her. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the open crate in front of her mother. She looked at the coin in Renata's hand. She looked at her mother's face. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. And her voice, for the first time since the eviction notice, had the quality of a real question rather than a brave pretense. The question underneath all the other questions she had been too careful to ask. Renata looked at her daughter. She looked at the room around them, at the shelves of ingots and vials and wrapped stones, at the 18 crates, at the expression on Maya's face that was trying very hard to be composed and mostly succeeding. "Maya," she said, "we are going to be so much more than okay. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you." They came back up into the light because they needed to, because the underground room was cold, and because Renata's mind was moving too fast to stay still in a confined space, and because Maya needed sunlight the way all children need sunlight, as a basic requirement for functioning. They sat together on the stone steps inside the building, not yet ready to go back out to the main street, not yet ready to be in open space, and Renata sat with the coin still in her hand and tried to think. The practical questions came first, because she was a practical person and practicality was how she managed the things that were too large to feel fully. She thought about what she had seen. The silver ingots, hundreds of them, on 3 full walls of shelving. The vials, the wrapped stones. The coins, 18 crates of them. The documents in the cases upstairs. The ceramic vessels she had not opened. She thought about what any of this could mean in terms of the life she and Maya were living. She tried to think about it rationally, as numbers, as a problem to solve, the way she had thought about the eviction notice and the job applications and the dwindling account. But the numbers were so far outside the scale of anything she had been calculating that her mind kept sliding off them, unable to find purchase. She thought about what she needed to do next. And the answer to that was, tell no one. Not yet. Not until she knew what she was dealing with. Not until she understood the legal landscape. Not until she had some basis for knowing who to trust and with what. She had learned, in the years of difficulty, that information was a resource like money, and that giving it away without return was one of the fastest ways to end up with less than you started. She put the coin in her pocket and stood up. "We're not going to tell anyone about this yet," she said to Maya. Maya looked up at her. "Iris." "Not yet. Nobody. Just us." Maya considered. "For how long?" "Until I understand what we have and what it means and who needs to know." Maya nodded slowly. "Okay, but I'm writing it in my notebook." Renata almost smiled. "That's fine, but the notebook stays with you." "Always does," Maya said. The days that followed had a quality of the surreal dressed in the ordinary. Renata continued the work of making the general store livable, continued the methodical repairs, continued the routine of camp stove meals, and early mornings and evening conversations with Maya about what they had seen and what it might mean. From the outside, if anyone had come to Dalton and looked, they would have seen a woman working on old buildings and a child exploring, nothing more. The locked building, now with its door pulled to but not secured, the lock mechanism being beyond repair, was simply a part of the inventory. She did not padlock it from outside because a padlock would have invited speculation. She pushed an iron bar through the handle brackets on the inside and left it that way, accessible to her and Maya and invisible to anyone passing. She spent 3 evenings doing research on her phone, sitting in the light of the camp lamp after Maya slept. She read about silver ingots and their value and the markers that distinguished refined silver from raw ore. She read about 19th century American coinage and what made certain coins significantly more valuable than their face value. She read about the Harrow Creek Mine and found, on a New Mexico mining history archive, a document she had not found before, a federal survey from 1968, the year before the mine closed, that referenced the Harrow Creek operation as one of the most productive small-scale silver operations in the state's history and noted that its owners, the Harrow family, had extracted an estimated value in excess of $4 million over the mine's operating lifetime. $4 million in 1968. She ran the calculation. She sat very still with the result. She read about uncut gemstones and the minerals found in association with silver deposits in New Mexico, and she read about a specific stone, found sometimes in the Mora County region, that was associated with volcanic intrusions in the local geology, a stone that in its rough form looked like a dark, irregular pebble, and in its refined form was worth considerably more than most people imagined. She read about estate law and property law and the question of what belonged to whom when found on private property. She read this very carefully, and what she found was this. In the state of New Mexico, objects found on private property belong to the property owner, with specific exceptions for cultural artifacts and certain categories of mineral rights. She was the property owner. She had the deed. She had paid the taxes. The county had transferred the property to her in full. Whatever was in that underground room was hers. She closed her phone and sat in the dark for a while. The desert night was doing its usual work, the stars asserting themselves in the absence of any competing light, the silence absolute enough to have texture. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of the wind moving through the gaps in the locked building's walls, the same almost breath she had heard on the first night. She thought about the Harrow family, about who they had been and what had happened to them. She searched for them again, more carefully this time, and found a thread she had missed before. The Harrow Creek Mine's principal owner at the time of closure had been a man named Samuel Harrow, the third generation of the family, to work the operation. The mine had closed not from depletion of ore. She found this surprising and returned to it twice to be sure she had read it correctly, but from a legal dispute with the federal government over water rights, a dispute that had dragged through the courts for 3 years before being settled unfavorably for Samuel Harrow in 1969. He had been forced to close the mine and could not afford to reopen it. Records indicated he had left New Mexico shortly after, settling eventually in Arizona. He had died in 1987. His children, 2 daughters, had no record of involvement with the Dalton property or the mine after 1971. Nobody had come back. Nobody had come back because Samuel Harrow had lost a legal battle and left in defeat, and whatever he had sealed in that building at the end of the main street, whatever he had intended to return for, he had not returned for. And his children, who may or may not have known what their father had left behind, had either not known precisely where to look or had looked and not found it, or had believed, after decades of the county's indifference, that the property had been lost to taxes and was no longer accessible. She thought about Samuel Harrow for a long time, about what it meant to build something over generations and lose it to a legal decision made in an office by people who had never set foot in Dalton, about what it meant to seal your most valuable things in the best room you could build and walk away from them because you had no choice, about the fact that those things had waited, sealed in stone and iron and dry desert air, for 53 years. She did not feel guilty about what she had found. She had searched for it legally, purchased the property legally, and found it in the course of examining what was hers to examine. But she felt something, a weight of obligation that was distinct from legal entitlement. The feeling that some things carry a history that matters beyond their monetary value, and that knowing that history is part of being worthy of the responsibility. She went to sleep with her mind still working and woke the next morning knowing what her next step needed to be. She needed an expert, not a local expert, not someone connected to the county or the state or any entity that might have a competing interest, an independent appraiser, someone she could bring to Dalton quietly and whose professional obligation was to her. She called Deanna. Deanna answered on the second ring, which was normal for Deanna, who treated unanswered calls as a form of failure. "How's the ghost town?" Deanna said. "Interesting," Renata said. "I need a favor." "Another $100? "No. I need you to find me the name of a reputable independent appraiser. Someone who handles historical artifacts, precious metals, collectibles. Someone discreet." There was a pause on the line. The particular quality of silence that occurs when someone who knows you well is recalibrating their understanding of your situation. "Renata," Deanna said. "Yes. What did you find?" "Something interesting." Another pause. "How interesting?" "The kind of interesting that requires a professional opinion before I can say anything more." The pause this time was longer. "I'm going to need you to call me after you talk to this appraiser." "Yes," Renata said. "You will." The appraiser Deanna found was a woman named Dr. Catherine Marsh, based in Santa Fe, with a background in historical American artifacts and precious metals and a secondary specialty in numismatics. which was the study of coins, and whose name appeared in the acknowledgments of 2 academic papers about southwestern mining history. She was, from everything Renata could find about her online, precisely the right person. She was also expensive. Renata called her from the steps of the general store on a Tuesday morning while Maya worked on the math exercises they had downloaded before leaving Albuquerque. She explained that she had recently acquired property in Mora County through a tax auction and had discovered what appeared to be historical artifacts of potential significance. She gave no detail beyond that. She asked if Dr. Marsh would be willing to make a site visit for an initial assessment. Dr. Marsh asked several questions in the careful, systematic way of an expert who has been called to assess things that turn out to be nothing more often than things that turn out to be something. She asked about the nature of the artifacts, and Renata said historical storage vessels, coins, possible, or samples. She asked about the provenance, and Renata gave what history she had about the Harrow Creek Mine. She asked about access, and Renata described the road. There was a pause at the end of all this, the considering pause of a professional evaluating whether something is worth her time. "I can be there Friday," Dr. Marsh said. "Friday is good," Renata said. She spent the days between Tuesday and Friday doing 2 things. The first was continuing her work on the general store, because the work needed doing and because having something physical to do with her hands kept her mind from spinning loose. The second was documenting everything. She photographed every shelf, every ingot, every vial, every wrapped stone, every crate. She photographed the documents in the cases without opening the rolls. She photographed the ceramic vessels sealed with wax. She photographed the coin she had taken from the first crate and then put back. She did this with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, because documentation was protection, and protection was what you built when you knew from experience that unprotected things got taken. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Dr. Catherine Marsh arrived on Friday morning in a dusty white Land Cruiser, pulling to a stop in the middle of Dalton's Main Street, with the particular competence of someone who has driven to remote places before and knows that hesitation does not improve the road. She was perhaps 60, compact and precise in her movements, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of field work into something that conveyed both warmth and the immediate impression that she was not going to waste her time or yours. She shook Renata's hand and looked at Maya with the particular attention that some adults give children, taking them seriously as people rather than periphery, which Maya noticed and responded to by standing up slightly straighter. "You found this place through a tax auction," Dr. Marsh said, looking up the main street. $100, Renata said. Dr. Marsh's expression did not change exactly, but something shifted slightly behind her eyes. "Right. Lead the way." Renata took her to the building at the end of the street. Dr. Marsh examined the exterior before going in, walking the perimeter the way Renata had on her first morning, hands occasionally touching the sandstone walls, pausing at the sealed window, studying the iron bands on the door with an attention that suggested she knew exactly what she was looking at and found it significant. Inside, she was slower. She moved through the room with a small flashlight and a hand lens, and she made sounds under her breath that were not quite words, but communicated a running internal assessment. She looked at the ceramic vessels without touching them. She opened each of the wooden cases and leaned over their contents with her lens. At the open case of vials, she picked one up and held it to the light from the window and was silent for 30 seconds. "May I?" she said, looking at Renata. "Please," Renata said. She carefully opened the vial, catching the dried wax seal in her palm, and tilted it so a small amount of the dark, heavy substance ran onto her fingertip. She looked at it, touched it to the tip of her tongue, nodded once. "Silver ore," she said. "Refined to a high degree. This is not raw ore. Someone processed this significantly before storing it." "The mine had processing facilities," Renata said. "On site. They used them thoroughly," Dr. Marsh said. She resealed the vial, set it back in the case, and turned to the trapdoor. "Is there more?" she asked. "Yes," Renata said. She led Dr. Marsh down the steps. The sounds Dr. Marsh made in the underground room were different from the sounds she had made above. Quieter, more contained. The sounds of someone who had prepared a certain level of expectation and was now in the process of revising it significantly upward, and who was doing so with professional restraint. She moved along the shelf slowly. She counted ingots under her breath. She examined the vials on the right wall, picking up 4 different ones, opening 2, using her lens on one. She went to the crate room and stood in the doorway looking at the stacked crates, not going in, just looking, for perhaps a minute. Then she turned around. "The documents upstairs," she said. "Have you read them?" "I haven't opened the rolls," Renata said. The leather ties were fragile. "Good," Dr. Marsh said. That was the right call. She looked around the underground room one more time. Then she looked at Renata. "How long have you been sitting on this?" 9 days since I found the room," Renata said. 4 days since I called you." Dr. Marsh nodded. "And you haven't told anyone?" "My friend who found your name knows something significant exists. My daughter knows what I know. Nobody else." Dr. Marsh held her gaze. That was also the right call. They came back upstairs and sat on the stone steps, Renata and Dr. Marsh together, Maya a step above with her notebook open, pretending to write in it, but listening to every word. Dr. Marsh was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that precedes something substantial. "I want to be careful about preliminary estimates," she began, "because this situation warrants professional quantification before anyone assigns specific numbers to anything. But I'm going to tell you what I'm seeing in broad terms so that you understand the magnitude of what you're dealing with." Renata nodded. "The silver ingots are refined product from a 19th century operation. Based on the quantity I can see, which is substantial, and the current price of silver, and the premium that historical refined ingots from documented mining operations command in the collector and institutional market, we are talking about a base value in the range of several $1,000,000. That is conservative." Renata heard the words. She received them. She did not react visibly, because there was a quality to this moment that required stillness. "The coins," Dr. Marsh continued. "You said 18 crates. If they are consistent with the sample I saw upstairs, and given the dates and the mint marks visible from my position, several of those crates likely contain coins of significant numismatic value. Coins from the 1880s and 1890s in the quality of preservation that a sealed, climate-controlled environment provides are not base metal coins. They are collector pieces. Some of them, specific issues from specific mints in specific years, command very significant premiums. Without a full inventory, I cannot give you a number. But 18 crates is not a trivial quantity." Renata said nothing. Maya had stopped pretending to write. "The wrapped stones," Dr. Marsh said. "I would need a gemologist to confirm, but I am reasonably confident, based on the weight and the optical properties I observed, that several of those stones are rough Alexandrite. Do you know what that is?" "No," Renata said. "It's a color-changed chrysoberyl, extremely rare, found in limited geological contexts, including some volcanic-adjacent deposits in the New Mexico region. In rough form it looks like a dark pebble. In refined form it is one of the most valuable gemstones in the world, more valuable per carat than most diamonds. The number of stones I could see on those shelves, if they are Alexandrite, which I believe they are, and if they are of the quality that color-change Alexandrite from this region can attain, is a number I am not going to say out loud without a qualified gemologist present and a formal assessment in hand." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the desert outside seemed to be holding still. "The documents," Dr. Marsh said, "may be the most important thing here. If those are the mine's operational records, which I believe they are, they will establish the provenance of everything in this room. They will make everything here legally and historically unimpeachable. They may also contain additional information about what was stored here and why that will be significant both legally and academically." Renata looked at her hands. At the coin she was no longer holding because she had put it back. At the ordinary, work-roughened surface of her own palms that had repaired floors and patched roofs and packed boxes and unpacked boxes and held her daughter through hard nights and written cover letters and stirred pot after pot of rice and beans through the long months of not enough. "What's the total?" she said. "Your best estimate. I understand it's preliminary." Dr. Marsh looked at her steadily. She was not a person who gave uncertain answers in order to be cautious. She was a person who gave accurate answers and prefaced them appropriately. "With the gemological question unresolved," she said, "I would estimate the metallic assets alone, the ingots and the coins, at somewhere between $20 and $40 million, depending on the numismatic quality of the coin collection. If the stones are Alexandrite of the quality I suspect, that number changes substantially. If the Alexandrite quality is high, and the quantity I observed suggests it very well may be, you could be looking at an asset value in excess of $100 million for the stones alone. She stopped. She let the number sit in the air for a moment. My recommendation, she said, is that you take no action publicly, make no statements, file no reports beyond what is legally required, until you have a complete professional inventory, a qualified legal team that specializes in historical estate and property law, and a gemologist on site. All of this can be arranged discreetly. I can facilitate introductions to people I trust. How quickly? Renata asked. 2 weeks, Dr. Marsh said. Perhaps 3. Renata nodded. She was doing the thing she did when the numbers were too large for her normal processing. The thing she had learned from years of reading menus in restaurants where she could only afford one item and had to make the rest of the table believe she wasn't counting. She was making her face calm. She was breathing at a normal rate. She was being, externally, completely steady. Internally, she was somewhere else entirely. One more thing, Dr. Marsh said. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a business card, which she held out to Renata. This is a property law specialist in Albuquerque. She handles historical estate cases. I have worked with her twice before. She is excellent. She is discreet, and she will tell you if there are any complications with your ownership claim. Are there likely to be? Renata asked. Dr. Marsh considered the question seriously. The property was legally transferred to you through a valid tax auction. The county had the right to sell. You have the deed and the tax transfer. The contents of the property, under New Mexico law, belong to the property owner with the exceptions I mentioned, and none of those exceptions appear to apply here. The Harrow family could theoretically make a claim, but they would need to establish that they maintained an ownership interest in the property during the 53 years it accrued unpaid taxes, which the county subsequently resolved through your auction. That is an extremely difficult legal argument. She paused. In short, I believe your claim is solid, but you should have it confirmed by someone whose job it is to be certain. Renata stood up. She extended her hand to Dr. Marsh. Thank you, she said, for coming, for being honest. Dr. Marsh shook it. Thank you for calling me and not a television crew, she said, which was the closest thing to a joke her professional demeanor appeared to permit. She looked at Maya as she left. Maya was still sitting on her step, notebook in her lap, pencil in hand, expression serious and thoughtful. You wrote everything down? Dr. Marsh asked her. Everything, Maya said. Dr. Marsh nodded with what appeared to be genuine approval. Good, she said. Always write it down. She drove away down the Dalton access road in her dusty Land Cruiser, and Renata watched her go, and then turned and sat back down on the stone steps and let the silence of the desert come back in around her. Maya came to sit beside her, pressing against her side in the way she had done since she was small enough to be carried. They sat there together for a while. $100 and something million, Maya said finally. Not with excitement. With the same measured gravity she brought to everything that mattered. Maybe, Renata said. It's preliminary. There's a lot to confirm. But maybe, Maya said. Yes, Renata said. But maybe. Maya looked down the main street of Dalton, at the buildings holding themselves upright in the desert afternoon, at the water tower and the church steeple, and the ghost of a lettering above the general store that had held a name for 100 years and was now becoming legible again, now that someone was there to see it. Those people who were mean to us, Maya said. The building manager who had handed them the eviction notice without looking up from his desk. The cousin who had laughed when Renata mentioned the auction. Her former supervisor at the restaurant who had told her, when she called to ask about a reference, that she should be realistic about her situation. What about them? Renata said. Maya was quiet for a moment. She was not, Renata knew, a vengeful child. She had not asked this as the precursor to something cruel. She was asking something more complicated than that. They thought they knew everything about us, Maya said finally. They thought they knew what we were worth, what we deserved, where we belonged. Yes, Renata said. They were wrong, Maya said. And there was no triumph in it. Just the plain, factual acknowledgement of something that had always been true and was now, perhaps, about to become visible. Renata put her arm around her daughter. Maya leaned in. The afternoon light was turning the desert gold, and the mountains behind Dalton were doing the thing they did at this hour, deepening in color from brown to a rich, almost purple red that made the whole landscape look like something painted rather than real. The town around them was still, full of waiting, full of what it had held for half a century in the dark. She thought about what she was going to do next, about the lawyer in Albuquerque, about the gemologist, about the process of transforming what lay in that underground room from something seen into something documented and quantified and legally established, and ultimately, carefully, wisely, converted into the kind of stability that she had been working toward for Maya's entire life. She thought about what it would mean to not have to worry about the front left wheel sound in the car, about what it would mean to look at Maya's asthma medication and not calculate whether there was enough month left at the end of the money, about what it would mean to give her daughter not just safety but possibility, not just enough but abundance, not the desperate abundance of people who have never not had enough, but the particular abundance of people who know exactly what not having it costs and hold it with both hands. She thought about her grandmother, who had fled one country for another with 2 children and a suitcase. She thought about the door you are afraid to open. She looked at the building at the end of the street, its iron-banded door slightly ajar now, the decades of sealed darkness beginning to breathe. "Maya," she said. "Yes. I need you to do something for me." "Okay. I need you to write down everything we've done. From the beginning. From the eviction notice to the auction to the drive here to the first night to today. Everything. As detailed as you can make it." Maya looked at her. "Why?" Renata looked at the building, at the desert, at the enormous sky that pressed down on everything with impartial grandeur. "Because someday," she said, "someone is going to ask us how this happened, and I want us to be able to tell them the true story, not the version where we were lucky, the version where we kept going when everything said stop, the version where a 7-year-old noticed what everyone else walked past." Maya considered this for a moment. Then she opened her notebook and uncapped her pencil. "From the beginning," she said. "From the beginning," Renata agreed. The sun moved toward the mountains. The shadow of the sealed building lengthened across the main street of Dalton. And in the underground room below, in the cold, dry, preserved dark, the silver ingots and the rare coins and the stones that changed color in shifting light sat, as they had sat for 53 years, waiting for the rest of what came next. It was already beginning. The lawyer's name was Sofia Reyes, and she arrived on a Wednesday in a car that was practical rather than impressive, which Renata took as a good sign. She was perhaps 45, with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades thinking carefully before speaking and had concluded that this was simply the most efficient way to operate. She shook Renata's hand and Maya's hand with equal seriousness and then looked up the main street of Dalton the way Dr. Marsh had looked at it, with the particular attention of a professional whose job requires reading places as well as people. "Catherine Marsh spoke highly of what you found," she said. "She was measured about it," Renata said. "That's her highest form of enthusiasm," Sophia said, and something in her expression suggested this was not an exaggeration. They walked the building together, Renata leading, Sophia asking questions that were precise and specific and occasionally surprising in their angle of approach. She asked about the county records and the transfer documents. She asked about the chain of tax liens going back through the decades and whether Renata had copies of all relevant documentation. She asked about the Harrow family and what Renata knew of them, listening with careful attention to the research Renata had done. She went into the underground room and stood in the same spot Dr. Marsh had stood and made no sounds at all, which was its own form of assessment. When they came back, upstairs she sat across from Renata on the stone steps with a yellow legal pad and went through the formal questions methodically. By the end of the conversation, she had covered 12 pages in a precise, small handwriting that Renata found deeply reassuring. People who wrote things down that carefully did not miss things. "Your ownership claim is clean," Sophia said when she had closed the pad. "The tax auction transfer is valid. The county had lawful authority to sell. You completed all required steps and are in full compliance. The contents of the property fall under your ownership as per New Mexico statute, and none of the exemptions apply to what you've described. Historical mining artifacts and precious metal products from a private operation do not qualify as cultural patrimony and do not trigger federal or state artifact protection laws." She paused, looking at her notes. "The Harrow family question," she continued. "I did some research before coming. Samuel Harrow's estate was settled in 1988. His daughters, Margaret and Louise Harrow, inherited his remaining assets at that time. The Dalton property was not listed among those assets, which strongly suggests that Samuel Harrow himself had written it off, possibly believing the tax debt had consumed it or that the property no longer had recoverable value. Neither daughter has made any legal claim to the property in the 38 years since. The statute of limitations on any such claim has long since expired. They have no legal basis for recovery. Are they still alive? Renata asked. Sophia looked at her. Margaret Harrow passed in 2019. Louise Harrow is 71 years old and lives in Tucson. Renata received this information quietly. My recommendation, Sophia said, is that we proceed with the full inventory and appraisal before any public disclosure. Once the assets are formally documented and valued, we establish a legal structure for their management before any sale or conversion. A properly structured trust will protect both you and Maya in the long term and manage the tax implications appropriately. This is not a simple windfall situation. This is a significant asset discovery that requires careful legal architecture. How long for all of that? Renata asked. The inventory and appraisal, with the team Catherine is assembling, perhaps 3 weeks to a month. The legal structure, another 2 to 3 weeks in parallel. You could have a complete and legally protected picture within 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Renata said. Possibly 5, Sophia said, with the precision of someone who preferred to underpromise. She looked at Maya, who had been sitting on her step throughout this entire conversation, writing steadily in her notebook. You're documenting this, Sophia said to her. Everything, Maya said without looking up. Sophia nodded. Good. If you're willing, I'd like a copy of those notes when this is over. For the record. Maya looked up. Something in her expression shifted slightly, a recognition of being taken seriously that landed with visible weight. Okay, she said. Sophia left in the afternoon, promising to return within the week with the formal documents for Renata's review. Renata walked her to her car and stood in the middle of the main street watching her drive away, and then turned to face Dalton, the full length of it, the buildings and the dust, and the water tower and the mountains behind, and she breathed in the dry mineral air and tried to understand where she was standing. She was standing in a ghost town she had bought for $100. She was standing in the middle of what might be the most significant discovery of her life. She was standing exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had known that since the night she woke at 3 in the morning and felt it like a fact rather than a feeling. She went back to work. The gemologist arrived 4 days later. His name was David Park, a consultant who worked primarily with auction houses and estate lawyers, and who came recommended by Dr. Marsh with a specificity of endorsement that left no room for doubt. He was younger than Renata had expected, perhaps 35, with the focused energy of someone who is always slightly more interested in the thing in front of him than in the conversation around it. He spent 3 hours in the underground room with equipment Renata could not name, working with a methodical intensity that precluded conversation. Maya sat at the top of the shaft and watched him work with the focused attention she applied to things she was trying to understand. Occasionally she wrote something. Occasionally she asked a question, and David Park answered it without looking up and with a completeness that suggested he respected the question regardless of its source. When he came back upstairs and into the building's upper room, he set his equipment on the workbench and looked at Renata for a long moment before speaking. Where did you find this place? He said. County tax auction, Renata said. $100. He looked at her steadily. You need to understand what I'm about to tell you. I do, she said. The stones on the right-hand shelving, he said. I tested 47 of them. A representative sample. 43 of the 47 are Alexandrite. The remaining 4 are a chromium-bearing spinel of secondary, but still significant value. The Alexandrite is of a quality I have rarely seen in my career. The color change is exceptional, the clarity is high for rough stones of this type, and the size range is well above average. Several individual stones in the collection would, when cut and refined by a skilled lapidary, produce finished gemstones of extraordinary value. He stopped. He was clearly assembling the next part. Carefully. The total rough weight of Alexandrite in that room, he said, is approximately 430 carats. Rough Alexandrite of this quality converts at roughly a 30 to 40% yield after cutting. At conservative market values for color change Alexandrite of this color saturation and clarity from a documented New Mexico source, you are looking at a finished gemstone value in the range of $160 to $250 million, depending on the individual stone quality, which will only be determinable after cutting. That upper bound could be higher. The room was very quiet. The silver ingots, he continued. I'll defer to Catherine's assessment there. The coins I'll need to look at more carefully, but from what I saw they're consistent with what she described. My preliminary sense is that the full asset value of everything in that room, combined, is in the range of $280 to $330 million. He looked at her. She looked at him. Conservative, he said. The Alexandrite alone could push it significantly higher. Maya had not written anything for 30 seconds, which was the longest she had gone without writing since Sophia had told her she wanted a copy of her notes. 315 million, Maya said quietly. Not as a question, as an anchor, a number to hold on to while the room reorganized itself around them. David Park looked at her. Roughly, yes. Renata sat down. Not dramatically, just sat down on the stone steps the way you sit down when your legs have made a decision before your mind has finished processing. She sat with her hands on her knees and breathed deliberately and looked at the floor of the room, at the geometric stone tiles that someone had cut and laid with such care in 1887 or 1892 or whenever this building had been built, stones placed by hands long gone into the earth, placed with the intention that they would last. They had lasted. She thought about the morning 2 years ago when the restaurant had closed and she had stood on the sidewalk outside it with 3 weeks of unpaid wages gone into someone else's disappearance and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had stood on that sidewalk and told herself, out loud, in the way you tell yourself things when there is no one else to tell you, that she was going to be all right. She had not believed it entirely, but she had said it, and she had gotten up every morning since that morning and moved forward through the space that saying it had opened. She thought about Maya's face on the sidewalk outside the housing office in the rain. She thought about 30 days. What do we do next? She asked, and her voice was steady, which was the one thing she had always been able to count on from herself. Steadiness, even when everything else was uncertain. David Park and Dr. Marsh, who had returned with him, exchanged a glance that was professional and brief and said several things without words. Full inventory, Dr. Marsh said. Formal documentation of every item. The documents upstairs need to be opened and assessed by a specialist in historical paper conservation. The ceramic vessels need to be assessed. Sophia's legal structure needs to be in place before any public disclosure or any asset movement. And you need to make some decisions about how you want to handle this. What decisions? Renata said. How public? How fast? And what you want to do with it. Renata looked at Maya. Maya was looking back at her with the expression she had worn on the first night in the general store, when Renata had told her that the people of Dalton had left things behind when they went. The expression of someone paying very close attention to what things mean beyond what they are. We have time, Renata said. We do it right. They did it right. The 6 weeks that followed were the strangest of Renata's life, stranger even than the months of sliding, because those had been coherent in their difficulty. This was incoherent in its abundance, and abundance turned out to require its own form of adjustment, its own learning curve of how to hold something carefully when you have spent so long holding nothing. The inventory team worked over 2 weeks, a group of 4 specialists assembled by Dr. Marsh, moving through the underground room and the upper room with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that this was the kind of work you only got right the first time. They cataloged every ingot, every coin, every stone, every vessel. They opened the ceramic vessels and found inside them additional refined or product, the concentrated outputs of a silver operation at the height of its productivity. They opened the documents under the supervision of a paper conservator from the University of New Mexico, who unrolled each one with the reverence of a person handling something irreplaceable, and who confirmed that they were exactly what Renata had believed them to be. The operational records of the Harrow Creek Mine, from its founding through its closure, including assay reports, production logs, extraction records, and a final inventory, written in Samuel Harrow's hand, of everything he had, placed in the building at the end of Dalton's main street before he left. The final inventory document, translated from Samuel Harrow's meticulous 19th century accounting, listed everything in the room and assigned to it the values of its time. The total he had recorded was $240,000. In 1971 dollars. The paper conservator held that document up to the light with shaking hands and said, very quietly, that she had been working in her field for 30 years and had never held anything quite like it. Sophia's legal structure came together in parallel, a carefully designed trust that protected Renata and Maya's interests, managed the tax obligations appropriately, and provided a framework for the conversion and management of the assets over time. She walked Renata through every element of it with the same measured patience she applied to everything, answering questions until there were no questions left, then waiting to see if more arose, which they did, and answering those too. There was one element of the legal process that Renata had raised at their second meeting, and which Sophia had thought about carefully before responding. Louise Harrow, Samuel Harrow's surviving daughter, 71 years old, living in Tucson. She had no legal claim. Sophia had been clear about that, and remained clear about it. But Renata was not asking about legal claims. She was asking about something else. I want to contact her, Renata said, before any public disclosure. I want her to know what was found, and I want to offer her something. Sophia looked at her with the expression she occasionally deployed when Renata said something that she had not anticipated and was now recalibrating around. That is not legally required, she said. I know, Renata said. It could open complications. I know that too. And you want to do it anyway. My grandmother left the country because she had to, Renata said. She left things behind. Not things like this, but things that mattered. I've thought about that a lot. About what it would have meant if someone had found those things and kept them without a word. Sophia looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something on her legal pad. I'll make contact through appropriate channels, she said. Discreet. No specifics until we know how she responds. Louise Harrow responded within 48 hours. She called the number Sophia had provided and spoke to Sophia for 20 minutes, and then asked if she could speak to the woman who had found the things her father left behind. Sophia passed the number to Renata with a note that said simply, she is not what you might expect. The call lasted an hour and 15 minutes. Louise Harrow had a voice that was elderly and precise and carried beneath its precision the particular quality of someone who had spent a very long time carrying something complicated. She had known, she told Renata, that her father had left something in Dalton. Not what, not exactly where. He had told her, late in his life, that he had not been able to go back, that the legal defeat had broken something in him that he could not rebuild, that he had sealed the building and left with the intention of returning when things improved and things had not improved, and then he had died. He had said, she told Renata, that he supposed whoever eventually found it would find it, and that he hoped they would need it. She said this last sentence and then was quiet for a moment. Did you need it? She asked Renata. Renata thought about the housing office, the rain, the 30 days, the $83. Yes, she said. We needed it. Louise Harrow was quiet again. My father was not a complicated man in most ways, she said finally. He worked hard, and he built something, and he lost it, and it broke him. But he would have wanted it to go to someone who needed it. He would have been glad of that. Renata made her offer then. She had discussed it with Sophia and had arrived at a number that felt right. Not a legal obligation, not a buyout, but an acknowledgement. A portion of the overall value, set aside as a gift from one family's history to another, a recognition that the things in the underground room had come from Samuel Harrow's work and his family story, and that those things deserved to be honored even when the law did not require it. Louise Harrow was silent for a long time after Renata named the number. That is more than generous, she said. It's what feels right, Renata said. Your daughter, Louise said. The one who found the building. Maya, Renata said. Tell her my father would have liked her, Louise said. He had a great appreciation for people who paid attention. Renata told Maya that evening, sitting on the steps of the general store in the last light, and Maya listened with the seriousness she brought to important things, and then said that she would write Louise Harrow a letter, a real one, not a message, because some things deserve paper. She said this with such matter-of-fact certainty that Renata simply agreed and said she would help her find the address. The public disclosure happened on a Tuesday in early spring, 41 days after Dr. Catherine Marsh had sat on the stone steps and given Renata her preliminary assessment in the careful, measured language of a professional who preferred accuracy to drama. Sophia had recommended a single press statement, clear and factual, released simultaneously to the regional press and the relevant authorities, followed by a brief statement from Renata herself. No television cameras at the site. No access to the underground room. No photographs of the assets until the formal inventory was fully complete and the legal structure fully in place. The statement went out at 9 in the morning. By noon, it had been picked up by every major news outlet in New Mexico. By 3 in the afternoon, it had gone national. By evening, it had traveled the rest of the way. The story of a homeless single mother who had bought a ghost town for $100 at a county tax auction and found a sealed underground vault containing what preliminary estimates suggested was $315 million in silver ingots, rare coins, and Alexandrite gemstones, as documented by independent experts and confirmed by legal representatives. Renata's phone, which had been a tool of desperate communication for 2 years, a device for sending job applications into silence and calling landlords who didn't answer, became something else entirely. She turned off the ringer and put it face down on the counter of the general store and went back to work on the section of the rear wall she had been repairing, which still needed doing regardless of what was happening in the rest of the world, because the wall did not care about press coverage, and neither did Renata at that particular moment. Maya, to her credit, handled the 3 journalists who turned up on the Dalton access road that afternoon with a composure that was remarkable in a 7-year-old and somewhat alarming in the sense that it suggested she had been preparing for this more than Renata had realized. She informed them politely but with complete clarity that the property was private, that no access had been granted, and that all inquiries should be directed to the legal representatives whose contact information had been included in the press release. She had memorized Sophia's phone number. She gave it to each journalist with the precision of someone reading a prepared statement. One of the journalists, a woman from the Albuquerque Journal who had been doing this long enough to recognize an extraordinary person when she met one, asked Maya how she felt about everything that was happening. Maya thought about it for a moment, looking at the journalist with that characteristic directness. "My mom kept going when everything said stop," Maya said. "I think that's the story, not the money. The keeping going." The journalist wrote it down. It ran as the opening line of the story that appeared in the following morning's paper, and from there it traveled with the rest of the coverage, repeated and quoted and shared in a way that Renata found both overwhelming and, in some deeply private corner of herself, vindicating in a way that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the 2 years she had spent being told by circumstances that stopping was reasonable and choosing not to stop. The voices came then, the ones that always come. Her former building manager, the one who had slid the eviction notice across the counter without looking up, gave a brief interview to a local television station in which he described Renata as a wonderful tenant and expressed his personal happiness at her success, which was a version of events that bore no relationship to any reality Renata had experienced, but which she absorbed with the calm of someone who has learned that the rewriting of history by people on the wrong side of it is simply a thing that happens and requires no response. The cousin who had laughed at the auction called. Renata listened to the voicemail, which was warm and congratulatory and contained 3 different offers to help manage various aspects of the situation, and then did not return the call. She was not cruel about it. She simply had a limited amount of time and had become, out of necessity, very precise about how she spent it. Her former supervisor at the restaurant, who had told her to be realistic about her situation, sent a message through a mutual acquaintance. Renata received it, understood what it was, and set it aside. Not with anger. Not with the particular pleasure of people who have been wronged and now watch the wrongdoers reach toward them from a suddenly altered landscape. She set it aside with the equanimity of someone whose energy was required elsewhere and who had long since stopped requiring external validation of the things she already knew about herself. There were other voices, different in quality. Deanna called, and this call Renata took immediately, and they spoke for 2 hours, and at the end of it Renata said that she was going to pay Deanna back, and Deanna said that $120 was not the thing she was calling about, and Renata said she knew that, and they both laughed, and then were quiet for a moment in the way of old friends who have come through something together and do not need to name what it was. Iris Begay, who had watched Maya while Renata drove to Las Vegas for tools, and who had brought biscuits and said come find me if you need anything, received a call that surprised her and a subsequent conversation that she would describe to her husband that evening as the most extraordinary thing that had happened to her in 30 years of living next to a ghost town. Renata asked if there was anything Dalton could do for the community of Mora, and Iris, after a silence, said that the school needed a new roof and the road needed work, and that there were 3 families in the area who had been having a very hard winter. Renata wrote all of this down. The media interest intensified before it abated. There was a period of perhaps 2 weeks during which Dalton appeared on the satellite maps of every news organization in the country, and the access road saw more traffic than it had seen in 50 years, most of which was stopped at the property line by the simple fact that Renata had arranged for it to be gated during the inventory process, a decision that Sophia had recommended, and that turned out to be one of the most important practical choices she made. Access to the site was controlled. Access to Renata was controlled. The story was allowed to be what it was, extraordinary and real and complete in itself, without being consumed by the apparatus that attaches itself to extraordinary things when they are not protected. She gave one interview. She chose the journalist from the Albuquerque Journal who had written down Maya's words about keeping going. The interview took place in the general store, which Renata had by this point made genuinely comfortable, the floor sound, the walls patched, the windows clean, a proper table and chairs sourced from a second-hand store in Las Vegas, and a camp lamp replaced by an actual lamp running from a small generator that she had acquired in the second week. The journalist sat across from her and asked questions for 90 minutes, and Renata answered them in the way she answered everything, directly, without performance, with the particular lack of self-pity that comes not from having had an easy life, but from having decided that self-pity was a resource expenditure she could not afford. She talked about the eviction, about the job applications, about the $83, about finding the listing, about Deanna and the jacket and the $120, about the drive through the desert and Maya's face at the window, about the first night in the general store and the smell of old wood and time, about the locked building and the iron handle and the cold air from below and the shelves and the ingots and the stones that caught the light in a way she had not had language for until David Park gave her the word Alexandrite. She talked about Dr. Marsh and Sophia and Louise Harrow and the phone call and what Louise had said about her father and what Renata had offered and why. She talked about Maya. The journalist asked what she wanted people to take from the story, and Renata was quiet for a moment, looking at the window of the general store, at the main street of Dalton visible through the old glass. I want people to understand that the decision that looked like the worst decision of my life, she said, was also the most important one, because it was the one I made when I had nothing left to lose, which meant it was the one I made without fear. And I think the things we do without fear, when we have no choice but to trust ourselves, those are the things that change us. Not just our circumstances. Us. The journalist wrote it down. It ran the following Sunday on the front page, and the version of the story it told was the true one, or as close to the true one as journalism can get, which is to say it got the facts right and the shape of the thing right, and the part about Maya's words ran early, and the part about the Harrow family and Louise ran near the end, and the ending was the door of the general store and the main street of Dalton and a woman who had chosen to keep going. The formal appraisal was completed on a Thursday. Renata sat in Sophia's Albuquerque office with Dr. Marsh and David Park and a senior representative from one of the country's oldest auction houses, who had driven from New York for the meeting, and Sophia spread the documents across the conference table and walked through them with the systematic care she applied to everything. The final assessed value of the Dalton vault contents was $317 million. Broken down, the silver ingots, fully inventoried at 612 pieces of refined silver product, assessed at $31 million at current market with a historical provenance premium. The coin collection, cataloged at 43,000 individual pieces across the 18 crates, with a significant proportion of numismatic value attributable to specific rare issues, assessed at $68 million. The Alexandrite stones, 422 carats of rough gem-quality Alexandrite, with exceptional color change, assessed by 3 independent gemologists at a combined estimated finished value of $214 million. The remaining ceramic vessel contents and chromium spinel stones, assessed at $4 million. $317 million. Renata sat across the table from people who dealt in large numbers professionally and looked at the document in front of her, and she felt something that was not quite any single emotion, but was all of them at once, compressed into a physical sensation that settled in her chest and stayed there, warm and permanent, like something that had finally stopped moving. She thought about the camp stove, about the granola bars, about the camp lamp they had used in the first weeks before she got the generator, about Maya's asthma medication calculated against the remaining balance of an account that no longer had a remaining balance problem. She thought about the wheel sound in the front left of the car, which she had finally taken to a mechanic in Las Vegas the previous week, and which had turned out to be a worn wheel bearing that cost $240 to fix, a cost she had paid, without calculating how many days of groceries it represented, which was the first time she had made a purchase that way in 2 years, and which had felt, in its small and practical way, like the beginning of something. "I want to ask about the disbursement structure," she said to Sophia, and her voice was completely steady, and Sophia looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the expression of someone who has been doing this work for 20 years and rarely meets a client who sits down to the largest financial conversation of their life and leads with a practical question. "Of course," Sophia said. They talked for 3 hours. What emerged from those 3 hours was a plan that Renata had been building in her mind for weeks, refined by conversation and adjusted by expertise and anchored by the same priorities that had always been her priorities, even when the gap between those priorities and her circumstances had felt unbridgeable. Maya first. Stability before abundance. Community as obligation. The long view over the immediate. A substantial portion went into the trust structured for Maya's future, education, opportunity, the kind of security that meant she would never have to make a decision purely out of fear, which Renata considered the most valuable thing she could give her daughter and the thing she had most wanted to give her and most often felt furthest from providing. A portion went to Dalton itself. Renata had decided early, before the appraisal was complete, before the numbers were confirmed, that the town was not merely an asset to be liquidated but a responsibility to be honored. The plan she had developed, with input from a historic preservation consultant Sophia had connected her to, involved a careful restoration, not a development, not a tourist attraction, not a commercial venture, but a restoration. The buildings preserved. The underground room documented and protected. The history of the place acknowledged and made accessible. A small endowment to maintain it in perpetuity. Dalton had waited for someone who would know what to do with it. She intended to be that person. A portion went to the community around it. The school roof in Mora. The roadwork Iris had mentioned. The 3 families who had been having a hard winter, along with others that a quiet process of inquiry identified over the following weeks. These disbursements were made without announcement or attribution, which was how Renata preferred it, because she had been on the receiving end of help and knew that the quality of help is not measured by how visible the giving of it is. And a portion, carefully calculated and legally structured, went to Louise Harrow, as the acknowledgement of history that Renata had promised. The conversation she had when she called Louise to tell her that the formal appraisal was complete and that the transfer would be processed within the week was the shortest significant conversation of the entire process. 37 minutes. Louise said very little. At the end, she said that she wished she could show her father, and Renata said that she hoped he would have been glad, and Louise said that she knew he would have been. The thing that happened to Renata in the months that followed was not what she had expected transformation to look like. She had imagined, in the abstract way one imagines things one has not experienced, that a change in financial circumstances of this magnitude would feel like a sudden shift, a before and after with a sharp line between them. What she found instead was that the shift had been happening for longer than she realized. It had started the night she sat in the dark apartment and opened the laptop and searched for things she couldn't afford because looking felt like a form of action. It had continued through every morning she had gotten up and moved forward when not moving forward would have been easier. The money was not the transformation. The money was the evidence of the transformation. The transformation had been Renata herself, becoming someone who made the decision that looked like the worst decision, who took the road nobody else had taken, who opened the door she was afraid of. She stayed in Dalton for the first 3 months while the restoration began. She and Maya lived in the general store, which by now was genuinely comfortable, the repairs complete, the windows clear, a wood stove installed that made the winter evenings warm and orange-lit and full of the smell of pinyon. Maya had been enrolled in a school in Mora, which required a 40-minute drive each way that Renata made in a car that no longer made any concerning sounds, and which Maya treated as an opportunity to read, which she did, methodically working through a library she had selected herself and which reflected a range of interests that Renata found both impressive and slightly humbling. Maya wrote the letter to Louise Harrow. It was 4 pages long, written in the careful handwriting she was developing and full of the particular observations that characterized everything she produced: specific, attentive, honest. She told Louise about finding the window at the base of the south wall. She told her about the stone tiles and the lamplight. She told her that her mother had sat on the floor of the underground room for 3 minutes with a coin from 1889 in her hand and had not made a sound. She told her that she thought Samuel Harrow had built that room for someone exactly like them, even if he couldn't have known it. Louise wrote back. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, handwritten on cream paper in a precise, elderly script. She thanked Maya for writing. She said that she had grown up hearing stories about Dalton and had always wondered what had been left there. She said that reading Maya's description of the stone tiles and the iron handle and the cold air from below was the closest she had come to seeing it herself, and that it was enough. She said her father had worked his whole life to build something that would outlast him, and she thought perhaps it had, just not in the way he had expected. She enclosed a photograph. A man standing in front of a sandstone building, squinting slightly in the sun, his hand resting on the iron-banded door. On the back in the same precise script were the words, Dalton, New Mexico. Samuel Harrow, 1968. Renata found Maya sitting at the table in the general store looking at the photograph for a very long time. She sat down beside her. They looked at it together. At the man who had built the room and sealed the door and not come back. At the door he had built to last, and that had lasted. He looks like someone who kept going, Maya said. He does, Renata agreed. She had the photograph framed. She hung it in the building at the end of the main street, in the upper room, above the workbench, where the wooden cases had sat for 50 years. Not because it made sense architecturally, because it made sense in every other way. She had been thinking, through all of this, about what she wanted to build. Not just for Maya, not just for Dalton, but for herself. The version of herself that had slid toward nothing for 2 years had been replaced, gradually and without ceremony, by the version that had gotten up every morning and kept going. She wanted to be useful to that version of events. She wanted the things she had been through to mean something beyond her own family's story. She established a small foundation. It had a simple mandate: to provide practical support to single parents facing housing instability, the kind of support that was concrete rather than administrative, help with deposits, help with first and last month's rent, the specific financial bridge between not having enough and having enough to start. She funded it quietly and administered it through a network of community organizations that Sophia helped her identify, and she put no name on it that connected it to her, because the help was the point and not the attribution. She also, in the 6th month after the disclosure, accepted the invitation she had received from a culinary program in Albuquerque to speak to a cohort of students who were training for careers in the food industry. She had not anticipated that this would be significant. She had anticipated talking about resilience and persistence in a general way, the kind of talk people in her position were expected to give. Instead, she found herself in a room of 23 people who were working towards something in the face of varying degrees of difficulty, and she talked to them the way she would have wanted someone to talk to her 2 years ago, directly, without the managed hope of inspirational speaking. She told them that the worst morning she had ever had was the morning she stood on a sidewalk with no job and 3 weeks of unpaid wages gone, and she had told herself she was going to be all right without believing it. She told them that she had said it anyway. She told them about the tax auction and the ghost town and the door she was afraid to open. She told them that the story was not about the money. She told them the story was about the moment you decide to trust yourself when there is no external evidence that trusting yourself is warranted. A young woman in the 3rd row had been crying quietly since about the 10-minute mark, with the specific control of someone who does not want to be seen crying and has developed a technique for managing it. At the end of the talk, she came up and said thank you in a way that contained more in 2 words than most people manage in paragraphs. And Renata shook her hand and held it for a moment and said what she had found to be true. You know more than you think you do, she said. The door you are afraid to open is usually the one you were meant to walk through. The woman nodded and went back to her life, and Renata watched her go and thought about her grandmother, who had said that first, who had said it to a child who wrote it into the part of herself where the true things live, and who had carried it across 34 years to a sidewalk outside a housing office in the rain, and from there, by a series of steps that had felt impossible and turned out not to be, to the main street of a ghost town at the edge of the desert where something had been, waiting in the dark for someone to need it enough to open the door. She drove back to Dalton that evening with the mountains in the windshield going red gold in the late light, Maya in the passenger seat with a book open on her knee, talking without looking up about what she had learned in school that day, which was something about plate tectonics and how the mountains were actually moving, just too slowly for people to notice. Everything is always moving, Maya said. We just can't always see it. No, Renata said. We can't. The access road was smooth now, graded and resurfaced as part of the community investment that had gone into the area, and the car moved over it without complaint. The gate stood open as it did during the day and closed at night, and when they pulled through it, the main street of Dalton received them in the way it had begun to receive them over these months, with the particular stillness of a place that has stopped waiting and started being. The general store lamp was visible through the window as they parked, the one she had left burning, and the building at the end of the street stood in the evening shadow with the photograph of Samuel Harrow just barely visible through the cleaned glass of its window, the man looking out with his hand on the door he had built to last. Maya gathered her book and her notebook and climbed out of the car. She stood for a moment in the middle of the main street of Dalton, New Mexico, in the last of the evening light, the same way she had stood on the first evening, arms slightly out, measuring the space with her body. "Mommy," she said. "Yes. I think we're home." Renata stood beside her daughter in the street of a ghost town that was no longer a ghost town, in the desert that stretched in every direction without apology, under a sky that was doing the thing it did at this hour, assembling its colors into something too large to look at directly. "I think we are," she said. They went inside together. The door of the general store closed behind them. The lamp burned. The desert night settled around the buildings of Dalton with the same unhurried patience it had brought to everything for 10,000 years, and the mountains held their positions, and the underground room at the end of the main street rested in its cleaned and documented and honored stillness, its shelves empty now, but its walls still, carrying the story, written in sandstone and iron, and the careful architecture of someone who had built for the future without knowing whose future it would be. It had been theirs. They had kept going until they found it, and they had known what to do with it when they did. The first frost of true winter came to Dalton on a night in November when the stars were so clear and so close that Maya stood outside for 20 minutes just looking at them with her neck craned back and her breath rising in small clouds, refusing to come in until she had identified every constellation she could name and invented names for the one she couldn't. Renata stood in the doorway of the general store watching her daughter stand in the middle of the main street of a ghost town in the dark, small and solitary and entirely at ease with the vastness surrounding her, and felt something that had no single word in any language she knew but that lived in the space where gratitude and grief and awe all press against each other and produce something larger than any of them alone. She had been feeling this thing more frequently. She had begun to think of it as the feeling of having arrived somewhere, not as a destination but as a vantage point, a place from which you could look back at the road you had walked and see its shape for the first time, see all the turns that had looked like wrong turns and understand that they had been the road itself. Maya came inside eventually, red-cheeked and satisfied, and announced that she had named 4 new constellations and written them in her notebook, and that the names were not negotiable. "What are they?" Renata asked. Maya opened the notebook. "The iron handle, the vial, the paper roll, and that one," she pointed up through the window at the sky, "is Samuel." Renata looked at her daughter. "Samuel? It looks like a man with his hand on a door," Maya said, with complete seriousness. Renata looked out the window at the sky and at the cluster of stars Maya was pointing to and could not see a man with his hand on a door, but did not say so. "I think that's perfect," she said instead. Maya closed the notebook and went to bed, and Renata sat by the wood stove for a while longer, listening to the frost working its way into the boards of the building and thinking about the year that had passed. Not reviewing it the way you review a ledger, looking for errors or confirmation of what you already suspected. Thinking about it the way you sit with something that belongs to you entirely, that cannot be taken back, that exists in your bones now the way cold exists in old wood. She had been offered things, in the months since the disclosure, that she had not expected to be offered. A book deal, twice, from two different publishers, both of whom described what they wanted in language that made the story sound like something that had happened to a character rather than a life that had been lived. She had declined both without spending much time on the decision. She was not ready to be a story that other people told. She was still in the middle of being a person, which was a different and more important thing. She had been offered a television interview, 3 of them, from programs that described themselves as human interest and whose producers spoke with the particular warmth of people whose warmth is professionally calibrated. She had declined those too, with Sophia's quiet approval and the instinct she had developed over the course of the year for distinguishing between things that served the story and things that served the story's consumption by other people, which were not the same thing and did not produce the same results. What she had accepted was smaller and, she believed, more real. She had accepted the invitation from a housing advocacy organization in Albuquerque to join their advisory board, not as a figurehead, but as a working member, attending meetings, reading reports, contributing to the specific and unglamorous work of thinking carefully about how to help people in housing instability in ways that actually helped rather than ways that looked like helping. She had accepted because she had been that person and she understood, from the inside, the difference between assistance that honored your dignity and assistance that consumed it, and she thought that was worth something in a room full of people trying to figure out how to do it right. She had accepted an invitation from the University of New Mexico's Geology Department, whose chair had contacted Sophia after the disclosure to express academic interest in the Alexandrite find, which was apparently significant beyond the monetary for reasons having to do with the geological conditions of its formation and what it suggested about the volcanic history of the Mora County region. She had agreed to cooperate with a formal geological study of the Harrow Creek Mine site, which was on the property adjacent to Dalton that she had subsequently acquired as part of the broader property consolidation Sophia had recommended. The mine itself was sealed and had been since 1969, and the geologists were careful and respectful and produced a preliminary paper that Renata read with genuine interest, learning things about the land she owned that she had not known, and that changed her understanding of what it was she was standing on when she stood in Dalton. The land, it turned out, was extraordinary, not just in what it had contained, but in what had made it contain those things. The geological formation underlying the Mora County property was a remnant of a volcanic intrusion that had occurred some 40 million years ago, and it was this intrusion that had created the conditions for the Alexandrite formation as well as the silver-bearing veins that the Harrow Creek Mine had exploited. The geologists described the site, in the controlled language of academic papers, as a formation of exceptional rarity and scientific interest. What this meant in non-academic terms was that the land itself, independent of anything that had been found on it, was a geological phenomenon. Renata read this and felt the particular pleasure of a person who has been sitting on something longer than they knew. The mine study led to something she had not anticipated. One of the graduate students attached to the project, a young woman named Carmen Vasquez who was writing her dissertation on mineral formation in volcanic intrusion zones, became a regular presence in Dalton through the autumn months. She was 26 and from a small town in southern New Mexico, and possessed the combination of intellectual intensity and practical capability that Renata recognized and respected. She drove up from Albuquerque twice a week, spent her days at the mine site with her equipment, and in the evenings occasionally sat with Renata and Maya on the steps of the general store in the last light and talked about rocks with a depth of feeling that Renata found both amusing and admirable. Maya found it entirely admirable and not amusing at all. She attached herself to Carmen with the purposeful attention she applied to people she decided were worth understanding, and Carmen, who had not had much experience being studied by 7-year-olds, adapted to this with a grace that suggested she was more flexible than her dissertation topic implied. She began bringing Maya small sample rocks from the site, each labeled with its mineral composition in a handwriting that matched the precision of someone accustomed to field notes, and Maya added them to the collection she had begun assembling in her room, a wooden box lined with cotton that she called the archive. The archive had begun as a repository for the things Maya had found in Dalton during the exploration weeks before the discovery. The tin button, the glass bottles, the newspaper fragment, the iron hook from the child's coat. It had expanded to include things from the subsequent months. A copy of the formal appraisal document, folded to fit. A printout of the article from the Albuquerque Journal, the one that had run Maya's words on the front page, which Maya had read once, carefully, and then folded and stored without comment. The photograph of Samuel Harrow, though the framed original was in the building at the end of the street. Louise Harrow's letter. She had also, with a care that moved Renata every time she thought about it, placed in the archive the receipt from the county tax auction. The official document confirming the transfer of the property formerly constituting the township of Dalton to Renata Cruz for consideration of $100, plus $11.40 in outstanding tax debt. $111.40. She had laminated it. She was 7 years old, and she had laminated a receipt for the purchase of a ghost town and placed it in a wooden box next to a photograph of a man who had built a room in that ghost town for someone he would never meet. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The restoration of Dalton moved at the pace Renata had set for it, which was deliberate and unhurried, guided by a principle she had articulated to the historic preservation consultant in their first meeting and returned to whenever decisions had to be made. She had said that she did not want to restore Dalton to what it had been, because what it had been was a town built around a resource that had run out, and there was no point in recreating a thing that had already ended. She wanted to restore it to what it could be, which was something she was still in the process of discovering, which meant the restoration had to stay flexible enough to accommodate the discovery. What was emerging, slowly and without a master plan, was something she had not fully anticipated. The buildings were being repaired with care, the sandstone cleaned and repointed, the roofs replaced where replacement was required and reinforced where reinforcement was sufficient, the interiors stabilized without being renovated into something they were not. The general store remained Renata and Maya's home, and she had made it fully comfortable without making it something other than what it was, the long pine counter still running the width of the room, the old shelving still on the walls, now holding books and maps, and the organized tools of a life being lived rather than the ghost of a commerce long concluded. The church had been the most complex project. The steeple required more intervention than she had initially hoped, the north support needing complete replacement, which meant dismantling the steeple partially and rebuilding it from the inside out. The mason she had hired for this work was a man named Gil Torres who had been doing this kind of work in New Mexico for 40 years and who approached the steeple with the calm certainty of someone who has seen worse and repaired it. He worked alone and slowly and talked to the steeple while he worked in the quiet, murmuring way of a craftsman engaged in dialogue with his material. And at the end of 6 weeks, the steeple stood straight for the first time since the photograph of Dalton in 1962, and Gil Torres drove away without making anything of it, as though straightening a 100-year-old steeple was simply a thing a person did on a Tuesday. The building at the end of the street, the sealed building, the building with the underground room, presented the most significant question. The underground room had been emptied over the course of the inventory process, each item removed, documented, stored in climate-controlled conditions while the legal and financial process worked through its stages. The room itself, cleaned and lit properly for the first time in over 50 years, turned out to be more extraordinary than it had appeared in lamplight. The stone tiles on the floor were something she had not been able to fully assess in the urgency of discovery. A specialist in historical stonework who came to examine them in the context of the restoration spent half a day in the room and emerged somewhat undone, describing the tile work as an example of craft that he had not expected to find in a mining town context in the New Mexico desert, the cutting precision and the pattern suggesting a stonecutter of significant skill, possibly trained in a European tradition, whose name was nowhere in the Dalton records, but whose work had survived 53 years of sealed darkness in a condition that made the specialist's hands unsteady when he touched it. Renata decided that the underground room would be preserved exactly as it was. The shelves left empty but intact. The tiled floor cleaned and sealed. The trapdoor restored and functional. The crate room behind the inner door left open and visible. And in the upper room, alongside the photograph of Samuel Harrow, she would place the final inventory document from the wooden case, the one written in his hand, the list of everything he had stored and the values he had assigned to it, under glass, properly conserved, readable by anyone who came to the building and understood what they were looking at. Because people would come. She had understood this from the beginning and had been making decisions with this understanding as their foundation. Dalton would not be a tourist attraction in the commercial sense, but it would be a place that was accessible and that held its history honestly. She was developing, with the historic preservation consultant and a small advisory group she had assembled from the regional academic and cultural communities, a framework for how that access would work. Guided visits. An archive room in the church, which had the right bones for it, that would hold the documented history of the Harrow Creek Mine and the town that grew around it and the people who had lived there. An ongoing relationship with the university geology program that would mean Carmen Vasquez and whoever came after her would continue to have access to the site for legitimate research. And a residency. This was the idea that had come to her slowly, gestured at from different directions before it assembled itself into something coherent. Dalton had 4 habitable buildings beyond the general store with work for buildings that could house people for periods of time. Artists, writers, researchers, craftspeople, people who needed the particular quality of a place that had opted out of the ordinary world and offered in its place silence and space and the company of history. She had talked to Maya about this, and Maya had said it was a good idea because the buildings wanted to be used, and she had talked to Sophia about it, and Sophia had said it was a generous idea and had begun drawing up the framework for the residency program as a component of the foundation structure. The first resident arrived in February. Her name was Theodora Kwan, and she was a ceramicist from Portland who had been working for 7 years on a body of work exploring the relationship between craft and geology, specifically the way that different mineral compositions affected clay behavior and glaze chemistry, and who had learned about Dalton from Carmen Vasquez, whom she knew through an obscure corner of the art-science intersection community in which both of them operated. She arrived with a car full of equipment, quiet and self-sufficient, and set up her studio in the building that had been the house with the fire ring of stones in its corner, which seemed to Renata the right building for someone working with fire and earth. Theodora was not the kind of person who imposed herself. She worked long hours in her studio and occasionally appeared in the evenings at the general store for coffee and the specific kind of conversation that happens between people who are both working on things that matter to them and who are willing to talk about that work directly rather than around it. She and Maya took to each other with a speed that suggested some people simply recognize each other without needing to go through the usual preliminary stages, and Theodora began including Maya in her studio in a way that was neither patronizing nor instructional but collaborative, the two of them working on problems together with the equality of people for whom the problem is more important than the hierarchy. Maya made her first ceramic vessel in Theodora's studio in March. It was small and uneven, and she fired it in the small kiln Theodora had set up, and it cracked along one side during cooling, which was a thing that happened, Theodora said, and was not a failure but information. Maya studied the crack for a while, and then placed the vessel in the archive, crack and all, and wrote in her notebook that information was more useful than perfection, and that she was keeping the vessel because the crack told her something about what she had done, and she wanted to remember what she had done in order to do it differently. She was 7 years old. She had been 7 years old for all of this. In April, she turned 8. Renata made her a cake on the camp stove, which was no longer the only cooking option, but which felt like the right implement for this particular occasion, the first birthday they had celebrated in Dalton, and they ate it at the Long Pine counter with Theodora and Carmen, who had driven up from Albuquerque with a bag of labeled rock samples she had chosen for Maya's archive, and Iris Begay, who had brought a tin of something she had made herself, and would not say what it contained until it was opened, and turned out to be the best thing any of them had eaten in recent memory. They sat around the counter in the general store of a ghost town in the New Mexico desert. 5 women of different ages and different histories and different ways of being in the world, and they ate cake and the contents of Iris's tin and talked about things that mattered to them, which ranged from Maya's ceramics to Carmen's dissertation to Iris's granddaughter, who had just started school, to Theodora's work and what the mineral content of the local clay was doing to her glazes in ways she had not predicted and found exciting. They talked the way people talk when they are in a place that has earned the conversation, when the room they are sitting in has done the work of establishing trust before anyone opened their mouth. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Renata sat at the end of the counter and watched her daughter's face in the lamplight, animated and present and entirely at home, and understood something she had been approaching from different angles for the better part of a year and had not yet arrived at directly. She had spent 2 years sliding toward nothing. She had experienced that sliding as the failure of external things, the job, the apartment, the account, the opportunities that did not materialize, and she had understood it that way, as a story about circumstance. What she understood now, sitting in the general store of a town she had bought for $100, watching her daughter turn 8 among people who had come to Dalton because of what Dalton was becoming, was that the sliding had also been a direction. It had been moving her toward the place where there was nothing left between her and the truest decision she would ever make. The decision made without cushion, without safety net, without the option of not trusting herself. The kind of decision that is only possible when everything else has been removed. She did not think she needed to be grateful for the 2 years of difficulty. She did not think hardship was instructive in the way that inspirational narratives sometimes implied, as though suffering was a curriculum with a clear graduation. She thought instead that she had been, in those 2 years, fully herself in a way that comfort might have made easier to avoid. She had found out what she was made of not because difficulty was a useful teacher, but because there had been nothing else to find out about. She was made, it turned out, of the same material as the sandstone walls of Dalton. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, not soft, but enduring in a way that outlasted the things that had tried to wear it down. And now, given the conditions it deserved, it was capable of holding things it had always been capable of holding. She thought about what she wanted the next year to look like, not in the financial sense, which Sophia managed with the competence that had made Renata trust her immediately and had not given her any reason to revise that trust. In the personal sense, the daily sense of what she was building and why. She wanted Maya to grow up in a place that had a story and that knew its story and that told it honestly. She wanted her daughter to understand, not abstractly, but in the concrete way that you understand things you have lived inside, that the world is full of things that have been overlooked and that overlooked things are not without value, that they are simply waiting for someone with the willingness and the specific quality of attention required to see them. She wanted Maya to be that kind of person, which she already was, and she wanted the place where she grew up to reinforce rather than erode it. She wanted Dalton to be a place that did something useful with what it had been given. The history, the geology, the story, the resources. She had been thinking about a school. Not a traditional school, something smaller and more deliberate, oriented toward the intersection of art and science and natural history that had already begun to take shape in the way the residency program was developing. New Mexico had pockets of rural educational poverty that were as real and as grinding as any urban version, and the Mora County area had its share of children who were smart and capable and under-resourced in ways that had nothing to do with their potential and everything to do with their geography. She was not ready to name this project yet. She was still in the early stages of understanding its shape. But it was there, forming in the background the way the right ideas form, without being forced. She talked to Iris about it one evening in late April, the two of them sitting outside the general store in the warmth that had begun to come back into the desert air, with the mountains in their evening colors and the main street of Dalton stretching quietly before them. Iris listened the way she listened to everything, with a patience that contained not passive acceptance but active engagement, and when Renata finished talking, Iris was quiet for a moment. "My granddaughter," Iris said, "drives 40 minutes each way to the school in Mora. Every day? The bus doesn't come out this far." "I know," Renata said. "She's the smartest child I've ever known," Iris said. "And I say that with full awareness that I am her grandmother and therefore biased, but also with full confidence that the bias does not change the underlying fact." "What's her name?" Renata asked. She did not know why she had not asked before. "Paloma," Iris said. "She's 9. Would she want to come here?" Renata asked. "To try something. In the church. While we figure out what it is." Iris looked at her. "She would want to come here the way a plant wants water," she said. "With her whole self." "Then let's start there," Renata said. Paloma Begay arrived the following Monday in the blue early morning, delivered by Iris in the truck, with a backpack that was clearly heavy and an expression that combined intense interest with the careful reserve of a child meeting a new situation and not yet knowing what it would ask of her. She was small for 9 and had Iris's quality of complete attention directed outward, the world receiving rather than generating her energy. Maya met her at the door of the church with the notebook under her arm and the directness she applied to everything she decided mattered. "I'll show you the archive first," Maya said, "because that's where the story starts." Paloma looked at her. "What story?" "All of it," Maya said. "This place, the mine, the people who built it, what my mom found, what the rocks mean. All of it. It's easier to understand everything else once you know the story." Paloma considered this for a moment. "Okay," she said. They went into the church together, and Renata watched them go from the steps of the general store and thought about her grandmother again, about the suitcase and the two children and the new country, and about what it meant to arrive somewhere with very little and build something from what you found there. She thought about how the building of things is always also the building of people, that you cannot construct anything of genuine value without also constructing yourself in the process, and that this was perhaps the most important thing she had learned in the years since she had driven a car with a broken while bearing down a dirt road in the high desert of New Mexico and stopped in the middle of a main street that no one else wanted. She thought about the door she had been afraid to open. She walked into the middle of the main street and stood in the same spot where Maya had stood on the first evening, arms slightly out, measuring the space with her body. The mountains were in their morning colors, cool blue-gray that would warm to gold as the day progressed. The buildings stood along the street with the patient solidity of things that have been given back their purpose. The church at the far end was straight now, the steeple vertical, catching the early light on its upper boards. From inside it she could hear, faintly, Maya's voice, telling the story from the beginning, the way Renata had asked her to, that night in the first weeks, in the voice of someone who understood that the story was not about the money. She stood in the sun for a while and let the warmth of the April morning do its work, the desert light that was its own form of wealth, the kind you could not put in a vault or appraise or convert into any other currency, the kind that simply was what it was and asked nothing in return but to be stood in and noticed. The sound of small feet on stone came from the church. Then the murmur of two voices, one already familiar, one finding its footing in a new place. Then quiet again, the kind of quiet that happens when two children have decided to do something together and are getting on with it. Renata closed her eyes for a moment. Behind her lids the desert light was red and warm and total. She breathed the mineral air that smelled of sage and old stone and the particular clean emptiness of high-altitude mornings. She thought about the night she had first seen the listing, the bad photographs, the gray, flat light, the description that had said nothing and the number that had said everything. $100 for a ghost town that no one wanted. $100 for a piece of land that had been waiting in the tax records for the specific combination of desperation and attention and willingness to trust herself that would bring someone through the door. She thought about Deanna, who had given her the money for the jacket she didn't need. She thought about Iris, who had said, "Come find me if you need anything," and had meant it. She thought about Dr. Marsh and Sophia and David Park and Carmen and Theodora and Louise Harrow on the phone, saying she knew her father would have been glad. She thought about Gil Torres talking to the steeple while he worked. She thought about Paloma Begay arriving this morning with the heavy backpack and the careful reserve of a child who was about to be surprised by something. She thought about all the things that had to be exactly what they were in order for this morning to exist. All the accumulation of choices, her own and others, the decisions made without knowing their consequences, the paths taken without knowing where they led, the doors opened despite the fear. She thought about what it meant to look back at all of that and see its shape, to understand that it had been moving towards something, not in the predetermined way of stories told after the fact, but in the organic and chaotic way of life that has a direction even when it does not have a plan. She opened her eyes. The main street of Dalton received the morning with the same steadiness it had always had, the quality of a place that had waited long enough to have learned patience as a permanent condition. She had things to do. There were always things to do. The framework for the residency program needed reviewing. The advisory meeting for the housing organization was next week. The geologists had requested a site visit to a section of the property north of the mine that their surveys had flagged as potentially significant, and she needed to think about what that meant and what she wanted from the engagement. The school idea needed its next stage of development, and Paloma arriving this morning felt like that stage had announced itself without waiting to be invited. She went back inside the general store, and sat at the pine counter with her coffee and her notebook and began writing down what she wanted to do next. Not what she wanted to have, or where she wanted to be, or what she wanted to become. What she wanted to do. The specific and practical and ongoing work of a person who has found her footing and intends to use it. The coffee was good. The morning was quiet. Outside, the desert held its ancient positions around the buildings of Dalton, and in the church at the far end of the main street. Two girls were learning the shape of a story that had started long before either of them was born and was still, with great intention and considerable hope, in the process of being written. Renata wrote. The pen moved across the page in her own handwriting, which was neither beautiful nor precise, but was entirely legible, which was all she had ever required of it. The words came without difficulty because she knew what she was doing and why, and those two things together, the what and the why held in the same hand, were the most reliable tools she had ever found. She had bought a ghost town for $100. She had opened the door she was afraid of. Everything else had followed from those two things, in the way that everything always follows from the moment you stop waiting for permission and begin. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.